Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon and good evening, depending on where you are. We have a global audience for this North America 2021 North America Think Tank Summit. The vast majority are from North America, Mexico, United States, and Canada, and it is a regional summit. We conduct regional summits in every region of the world, and then a global summit that takes place. Each of these takes place each year and has dealt with either both major policy challenges facing think tanks and policymakers, and then the central focus often is on the operational and strategic challenges facing think tanks, and we are at in many respects, which I describe as an existential and pivotal moment, both politically and in operational terms for many think tanks. And today's agenda, a mandate for leadership in a post-COVID pandemic world, focuses on that pivotal moment, an existential moment for many people and certainly for think tanks. And we are trying to address those dual challenges. We have consciously selected to focus on a post-pandemic situation and how institutions will deal with a workforce and workplace that is disrupted and transformed, and what will be the new and enduring policy challenges that we will need to face, and how think tanks need to prepare themselves for both. It's a mandate for leadership and the role that think tanks can play going forward. I want to thank Brookings, our longtime partner and partner for this program, the members of the planning committee, many of whom, including Brookings, CG, and others, that are what I describe as good citizens of the global think tank community, meaning that they support not only and work on the issues facing their institutions, but also work to address and support think tanks not only in North America, but around the world. That the ecology, the fragility of and providing support to sustain the work of think tanks around the world is in all of our interest, and these and other institutions in every region of the world, and certainly the members of the planning committee, help in that regard each and every year as we plan these programs. I want to thank the panelists and chairs who graciously and willingly accepted to serve on these panels, 3 panels that we have today. And each one is I think, consciously on our part, representative of the region. So we have representatives from each region. It's diverse in terms of gender, ethnicity, and political opinions. And so that is a very conscious effort on our part to make sure that there is a range of institutions that also reflect the various organizational types and diversity within not only the think tank community in North America, but globally. We are committed to the issue of diversity, not because it's politically correct, but because we firmly believe that in diversity there is innovation that helps in terms of new and innovative ideas, which think tanks should be about. And many of our efforts, including last week's Women and Think Tanks effort, is to achieve that and to focus, which will be the subject of a summit in July in the United Arab Emirates on Think Tank Future Talent Forum, which will focus on what are the challenges of recruiting and retaining key talent for think tanks around the world. There are 4 segments to the program today. A president's panel, which is intended to assess the implications of COVID and for each country, and once again looking forward to what are the challenges we face ahead. The second panel will focus on a workforce and workplace that is disrupted, and a range of individuals who are at a range of institutions will speak to the challenges during COVID, but the challenges that lie ahead in a post-COVID world, hopefully post-COVID, that they need to, and institutions need to address. And then the final panel is focused on the title of the session, which is Mandate for Leadership. What do we need to do moving forward? What are the specific actions? And I've asked each of the 3 panelists to essentially work and address 3 or 4 key points that we need as think tanks need to work on in the months and years ahead. Personally, I think that this is once again a pivotal moment, but it's a pivotal moment that we must seize as think tanks and provide the leadership and to resist being drawn into the partisan warfare. Both parties, both views in terms of the world, whether it's progressive, centrist, or conservative, need to figure out and be part of the solution and not part of the problem. That is, for me, why I spend time working with think tanks, why I'm committed to making sure that it is diverse and representative, that we can find a way out. We can provide the leadership that is necessary, especially at a critical moment like today. I would now like to turn it over to and open the first panel, which is a panel of presidents. Kate, are you here?
I am, yes.
Okay. So Kate has graciously agreed to chair the opening panel. She's the Chief of Staff at CNAS, and Kate, I turn it over to you to lead the first session.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. McGann. Again, welcome to the virtual 2021 North America Think Tank Summit. Like Dr. McGann said, my name is Kate Kett. I am Chief of Staff and Director of the Next Gen Fellowship Program at the Center for a New American Security. This morning, I'll be moderating a president's panel where we look to short and long-term impacts of COVID-19 at both the national and the regional level. In the past 18 months, we've experienced many of these impacts, from supply chain disruption to resource hoarding, cybersecurity challenges brought on by the sudden shift to a primarily virtual world, hybrid forms of policymaking as leaders face regular governance challenges amidst a global health crisis, and incredible levels of economic uncertainty with record unemployment. Now, as the world cautiously emerges into a new normal, we are also dealing with a new US presidential administration, vaccine disruption disparities, new strains of the coronavirus, and the looming question of what to keep from our time in the virtual space and what should return to how it was before. Here to talk about these impacts and about what their countries need to do to move beyond COVID to address national and regional challenges, we have a distinguished panel of guests. General John Allen, the President of the Brookings Institution, Celia Toro, Vice President of Programs, Studies, and Analysis at COMEXI, and Remington Kimadora, President of the Center for International Governance Innovation. General Allen, we welcome your opening remarks.
Well, thank you very much. It is wonderful to be with you all this morning. Kate, thank you for moderating this. CNAS is a great organization, and your prominent role in that only continues to enhance its reputation. So thank you very much for joining us today. Great to see Celia and Rohinton as well. The challenges that we're facing as we move forward, particularly at the domestic level, I think have been well spelled out by this administration. But I'll touch the principal issues, any one of which could be the subject of an entire day's gathering by the global community of think tanks. First, Jim, thank you very much for bringing us together. Brookings is honored to assist you in this however we can, but we're also deeply humbled to be part of this program and to work so closely with many of our partner think tanks around the world. I think the challenges that we're facing in the United States in many respects are the challenges that we will see more broadly in the world going forward. What the pandemic ultimately proved to many of us was the woeful state of the healthcare systems in many of our countries. And I know that for the United States, as we move forward, spending a lot of time determining what aspects of that institution failed, which were put under enormous stress, and which ones were successful will be very important to us as we go forward as a nation. But I know that's an area that we'll be thinking about more broadly at the global level as well. So the state of the healthcare system, were we ready for this pandemic? Could we have seen it coming? How might we at a national level and an international level prepare now strategically and operationally for the next pandemic? And as many of our scholars and experts will tell you, it isn't a matter of if this ever happens again, it's now a matter of when it will happen again. So first and foremost, what is the state of the national, when I say national, I mean any nation, the national healthcare system, and how can we work together globally to increase the importance and resilience of those systems, and how do we do it globally? Second is the global economy. An enormous beating in the United States and more broadly, our economies took an enormous beating in this regard. And we're working very hard in the United States to try to recover from this issue. The infrastructure bill just recently passed or headed to be passed is a bipartisan triumph for this administration early along, and it will do a lot to begin to remedy the challenges that we have faced economically as we move forward. And this is going to be the challenge that we face more broadly globally as well. The third area is, I think, it's very important, and that is this pandemic really exposed structural inequality in a very broad way. So many of our communities, communities of color, communities that were on the front lines of continuing our societal approach to this disease as it broke out more broadly in our communities. That aspect of our society was deeply exposed by this disease, and it showed us the difficulties associated with the healthcare system that is available to them, and how disproportionately the populations of color suffered from this disease for all kinds of reasons, economically, in the context of healthcare, et cetera, and their proximity to the disease without support more broadly from the society. So I think that the plight of our disadvantaged components of our population, to include women as well, who disproportionately suffered from this disease, is something that deserves a lot of concentration from us as we go forward. And then finally, there are 4 points, as I said: healthcare, the economy, structural inequality that's been exposed. And then finally, many political leaders use this as an opportunity to politicize this disease, to politicize their positions, to politicize the manner in which we would ultimately deal with this disease at a domestic level and in some cases more broadly at a regional or global level. And in the United States, the near catastrophic approach by the Trump administration early along in this created both the numbers of casualties and the numbers of sick that we're going to have to spend a lot of time looking at as we go forward to ensure that we can't permit the politicization of our solutions to a pandemic like this or a future outbreak, health crisis, or a future outbreak of this nature to happen again. So the political dimension, the structural inequality that has been exposed, the state of the economy that has suffered so badly from this, and ultimately the healthcare systems that we'll have to rely on going forward are just 4 components of how we'll be spending our time in the United States dealing with this, but more broadly hoping to partner at a global level to help to overcome this and prevent the next time we have a crisis like this from occurring.
Wonderful. Thank you for these 4 points, General Allen. Forward to diving into them a little Turning it over to you now, Ms. Toro.
Thank you very much, Kate. It's a pleasure to join you today for this North America Think Tank Summit. I'm quite new to think tanks. I was invited by Sergio Alcocer, the president of COMEXI, to be vice president of programs and studies, which I agreed with joy, but I have many things to learn about think tanks. Thank you very much, Jim, for the invitation. I thought about presenting a set of questions on the future of North America. In 5 minutes, of course. The North American project has stalled for more than a decade now, as we know. But Donald Trump, as Laura McDonald argued, has created what is perhaps the most serious crisis the North American project has faced. Question is, are we confronting a crisis of North America or the end of the North American project? First question. In order to answer this question, and assuming that it is a crisis that we want to overcome, assuming that we want to relaunch the North American project, I think that we have to focus on 3 questions regarding trade, borders, and ideas. Trade. We all know the rate of growth of economic integration, that is the rate of growth of investment to create regional value chains, has slowed since the year 2000. 2001 with the terrorist attacks, the Great Depression of 2008, the 2020-2021 pandemic, they all hit very severely trade and investments, particularly the North American region. Question. Is the U.S. still willing and able to be the engine of North American integration as it was during the first decade of NAFTA? How can we accelerate economic recovery in the 3 nations? How will the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement work after we leave behind COVID-19? What to do about rising inequalities within and across nations that have undermined support for trade and for migration? Borders. U.S. concerns about border security and U.S. border policies in particular to regulate 2 regional markets, the regional market for labor and the regional market for drugs, have not been conducive to the creation of a sense of community. Furthermore, policing of our borders, erection of barriers, creating new barriers to fend off what are usually or frequently inexistent or exaggerated threats have not effectively addressed the problems of drug smuggling or undocumented migration. So these policies have become a source of insecurity for all countries in the region. And at this point, Mexico, I believe, is doubting whether bordering on the United States is in fact an opportunity. Question. Where are the North American boundaries? Does North America end at Mexico's southern border with Guatemala and Belize? And if so, are we ready to deal together with migration as North American partners? How? And is Canada part of this? 3 ideas, and I finish with this. Where is the ideologue for North America? Where is the Robert Pastor of the post-pandemic era with compelling arguments in favor of a North American vision? Will there be popular support, domestic support for relaunching the project? And perhaps more important, what is the political purpose of North American integration today? What is the name of the game in North America? Competing with China? Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ms. Toro. Looking forward to hearing about this a little further from the Canadian perspective. We're turning it over now to Mr. Medora. Apologies, sir. I believe that you're muted.
that better?
Yes, thank you.
I thought someone else was controlling my sound for a bit. But anyway, I was saying that it is always good to be back with my colleagues in North America, with the group that Jim McGann animates so well, and with John and with Cecilia. Let me sort of make 3 points which actually have been made, but let me make them again, but slightly differently. And of course, as you said, Kate, from the Canadian perspective, which is that this pandemic was not unexpected. I mean, there had been people who had been sort of warning about it for a good long time. But as we know, as in many things, including investments, timing is everything. And so to be told it's coming is not enough. We certainly had no idea how and when it would start and so on. So the surprise element raises a series of public action questions, which I think caught us all, and I mean all, off guard. There's a jointness nature to the pandemic. There is a structural inequity that pandemics highlight, and those two are not surprises. The one that I suspect surprised me, at least more, including in Canada, is the question of confidence in public action and in science. And I'll sort of address all three of these. Let me deal with sort of jointness and inequity together. The jointness bit should now be evident to us all. I think this business about we're not all safe till everyone is safe isn't just a slogan. It's not something that's said to garner foreign aid. It is absolutely a fact. And I often refer to the International Chamber of Commerce study that was done in January, but since then the IMF and others have come in showing the multi-trillion-dollar effects of having the pandemic prolonged throughout the world. In other words, it is not enough to celebrate that we in North America or in Canada will have a good summer, be able to go to our cottages and restaurants and so on. If the pandemic continues and continues to mutate and generate mutations in other parts of the world that do not have the fortune of vaccines and good health systems and good economic responses, then in fact we're unsafe as well. And I don't mean that as some kind of touchy-feely statement. I mean that as pure economic and social fact. And so the jointness leads to a number of questions which I know are being adjudicated. And John is quite right to say that the Biden administration, and I don't mean this as a partisan statement either, has taken positions that are more globally cooperative, be it on TRIPS waiver or some version of it, be it on vaccine rollout, be it on the allocation of SDRs for debt relief. There's a series of things in which you find that the G7 and the G20 seem to be more whole than they were in the previous few years. That's a good thing, but in many ways, the vaccine and pandemic issue has also shown how much we can not rely on globalization when things really get bad. And so the early protectionism around PPE, the fact that we didn't have a vaccine, although one was developed as quickly and as efficiently as it was, are good things, but they also showed the cleavages that we face. And our colleague from Mexico, in fact, mentioned this within the regional context. So this isn't just something about distance. The inequity bit is striking. And what struck me the most is how the pandemic didn't sort of reveal new things to us. There were, in many cases, I know this happened in Toronto, it happened in New York, when you look at the neighborhoods where the epidemic raged the most, where the hotspots were, and you found that that map of the city cleaved exactly along the lines of socioeconomic disparities. And so if you think about that globally, we found the same thing, that if you divided the world into postal zones, the hot spots and the spots where vaccines were not available or were not being taken up, hived with other sort of indicators we had of marginalization and poverty. And so these kinds of inequity, this kind of sort of gap in global innovation systems requires public action. It requires knowledge, education, and fundamentally for us to believe that we're all in it together. And this is where I thought the most work needs to be done. You can develop a vaccine in a year. You can roll it out as quickly as you can. You can ramp up production capacity maybe in a year or two, we hope, which still means that we won't have herd immunity in many parts of the world till 22, 23, perhaps 2024. That's not good. But in 3 years, we think we will get there. How do you change ingrained public attitudes about skepticism towards what governments do, towards cooperation, towards the fact that the so-called elites might actually know something? I think that's a longer term project. It has to do with education, empowerment, with making societies whole again. And by the way, I should say think tanks, some of us have contributed to this problem. I think we've had decades and decades of this mantra that somehow governments are a problem and not the solution. And we now have to come out of that. And in the process, I hope that we develop a forward-looking agenda that takes us to something that is more coherent with the globalization we'd like to see.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Majora. It seems all three panelists have touched on, this sort of topic of inequities and inequalities, especially socioeconomic, that have really come to light during the pandemic. I'd pose the question to the panelists, do we think it's most effective to approach these socioeconomic disparities collaboratively, or do we think that there's work that needs to be done on sort of the individual national level before that collaboration can happen?
I'll communicate. I'm
Go,
sorry.
John.
Yes, I think both can occur simultaneously. I think we have the capacity and the breadth to do that. In the United States, as we have talked about recovery, there have been substantial conversations, not just with the federal government, but we're talking constantly with our state governments as well, as our governors and as our mayors are ultimately seeking to recover economically. But getting at the issue of structural inequality, the point that we have constantly made is that the investment strategies that will ultimately help us to recover at the local level, at the municipal level, at the state level, and then ultimately at the federal level, have to be investment strategies that seek to empower those communities that are most vulnerable as they're coming out. And those actually can be quite in consonance with, congruence with our overall national intent with respect, for example, for infrastructure. The components of the infrastructure plan, in fact, see substantial investment in areas in the country where, in fact, those disadvantaged populations, those most vulnerable populations, those that deal with substantial inequality can, in fact, benefit.
Turn them up because
but then we need to have a national objective of working with our partners in North America, Canada and Mexico, and more broadly in the world. The G7 was a good example. The G20 will almost certainly be a case for it. Our relations with the EU. Here are real opportunities for us to take a global perspective on dealing with inequality and using perhaps some of the metrics that we're applying in our own states, our own nations, ultimately to help to guide us in the overall global approach as well. And let me just make one point. This crisis refocused, I think, the world on the state system. And that put us in, as Rohinton said, it created a crisis for us in many respects because the institutions ultimately failed in many respects, and the crisis of trust ultimately emerged. So we have that tension between the state system and a loss of trust in that system, which means it's going to be difficult for democracies in many cases, and will be a good time for illiberals to ultimately cede to achieve some objective with respect to more control vis-a-vis the democratic processes. This is why we need to be thinking about the non-state actors, the private sector, et cetera, being partners with us as we go forward, so that we have a broad aperture for dealing with the crisis in our own countries, but also more broadly globally. And I'll cede the ground. I'm sorry for going on so long.
Mr. Majora or Ms. Toro, anything to add?
I think that unless I agree fully with John, unless we put inequality at the center of politics, we won't be able to overcome it. At least not in Mexico, where inequality is appalling. 50% of the population, as you know, are under the poverty line. This is 60 million people.
Right.
And of course, as you were saying, if you look at who got sick and who died, you can guess. And we were proud of having a very big and large public health system, which over the last 30 years have been reducing and reducing and shrinking, in which was not ready. Even we were proud of having the best vaccination policy and sort of infrastructure in Latin America without any doubt, but maybe even beyond that. It was a very successful program, vaccination program. We have hundreds of thousands of people trying to do vaccines, to put vaccines. And even that did not work as we expected. So I fully agree. We have to think about it and globally, because each country, of course, it's a domestic issue at the end, a very political and debated and confrontational issue. But unless we go together, it won't work. We are together. Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Medora? Apologies, sir. I believe you're muted again.
I'm quite convinced it's not me, but that's okay. I was saying I do think these two go hand in hand, and that making societies whole at home and walking that talk overseas are not things that you can do separately. In fact, if you did, it would backfire in either case. And so the example I'd give you is the fiscal responses to the pandemic. Some work that I did with the panel I belong to.
Talk to Lynn.
Please mute your mics.
Some work I did with a panel I belong to on fiscal responses found that the developed countries, through various economic stimuli, spent about 20 to 22% of their GDP to keep their economies humming in some ways. Emerging markets, that number was 6%. And for the least developed countries, it was closer to 2%. What that translated into was about $9,000 per capita in rich countries, $17 or $18 in poor countries. When you have that kind of disparity in your capacity to respond, it doesn't take a lot of redistribution to make the system slightly more equitable without losing your goal that if you don't have a constituency for global cooperation at home, you simply can't do any global cooperation. So I do take the point that we have to start rebuilding societies domestically. But I think the nature of the initial response was so unbalanced that we're now kind of going to see what that means going forward. And I don't think it's a total... So I don't think it's pessimistic to think that there may be some failed states that have been created by COVID. Because remember, COVID happened at the same time that countries have been grappling with small things like climate change and other sorts of crises coming their way.
Excellent, thank you. Well, we are unfortunately at time, although this was a fascinating little tidbit of a conversation, and I know that we could go on longer. Thank you, General Allen, Ms. Toro, and Mr. Medora for joining us this morning. Hopefully we're walking away with a little more insight, and hopefully as we move forward, as a think tank summit, we can think through Ms. Toro's question of is the North America project worth saving, and what can we do to be a part of that? So again, thank you to our panelists, and Dr. McGann, back over to you.
All right, Kate, thank you very much. By intent, these sessions in terms of diversity, one thing I didn't mention, which we're fully committed to at TTCSP, is the next gen. And Kate, you're a wonderful example of the future of think tank executives and scholars. So thank you very much for chairing the panel. Our next session focuses on the operational challenges facing think tanks in the COVID period. And we have a wonderful mix of individuals in various think tanks that have agreed to be on the panel. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Aaron Shull at CG. But before I do that, just two quick announcements. If you have questions, please post them in the chat. We will be collecting them throughout the program. And then secondly, at the end of the program, TTCSP over the last 18 months has created an intensive... Please mute your mics, whoever it is. Please mute your mic. You keep coming in to the program. The study is an 18-month-long study, intensive data collection on all of the think tanks in North America, and in many of the variables, the team has been incredibly successful, and we have 90% on key data, like staff.
Well, that's what Edwina said. Edwina said, David wants me to and talk to me about. Yeah, she told him that. But
can we find out who that is and mute their mic for them, since they seem not to be understanding and doing it? And so we have data on key statistics, and that will be from 10:30 to 11:15 at the conclusion of this program, and you are all welcome to join after the formal program. Aaron?
Thanks, Jim.
We will do our best to find who has not muted their mic.
I appreciate that very much. Thank you, Jim, and it's a pleasure to be with you all. I'm going to dispense with some of the formalities because we're short on time, so I'm going to skip introductions. But let me make one kind of point. This panel has two strategic objectives. The first was to outline the various challenges that we've all faced over the last 18 months, and believe me, on the operational side, there are many. The second, and probably more important strategic objective of this panel, is to highlight what we've done and what the best practices are that we've seen emerging in our own industry. And it's interesting, Jim, I wanted just to pause it for 1 second. You know, we talk about a think tank industry, and I don't want this to sound like, you know, I'm bragging for you, because it's not intended to be that way. But the reason that there is a community around this is because of you. And when I think about a community, I'll give you for instance, the prep call for this panel, my colleague Julie from the Atlantic Council called in from her vacation to prepare for this panel because she views it as valuable, because there is a community. So thank you to Jim for that. So I'm going to go to the panelists in alphabetical order for a brief set of kickoff remarks. I've asked them to answer two questions. Number one is, what is the biggest challenge that you and your organization have seen in the last 18 months? And number two is, what are the common challenges faced by all institutions? And kind of just to walk us through some of those big buckets and the unique challenges that you face. So we're going to go in alphabetical order. Liliana, over to you.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank you, Jim, for the invitation. I am more than pleased to share this panel with such distinguished speakers. So regarding the question on the biggest challenges that Ethos has faced over the last 18 months, because of time constraints, I would like to highlight only one common problem and perhaps two unique challenges faced by Ethos and a couple of ideas on how we're coping with them. So the first challenge would be related to how we're going to return to the workplace and the possibility of adopting a hybrid model. So given that Ethos is located in Mexico City, and around 3/4 of our staff has not been vaccinated. However, as of now, we notice that it will be difficult to go back to the previous model where only very few cases of people were working from home. So starting July, we will have a small private office inside a co-working space, and we will basically see how it works for everyone in the following months. However, even that model presents many challenges, since the convenience of not having to commute very long distances in the largest city in the world is very difficult to overcome. Just so that you know, my average commute time before the pandemic was around 2 hours. So going back to our particular challenges, I will mention the possibility of losing the sense of belonging to the organization. During this period, we've hired some people who, as a result of the situation, have the feeling of being more like external consultants rather than part of Ethos. This is due to the difficulty of obviously doing virtual team building activities in a scenario where the use and the abuse of virtual meetings makes the idea of mingling with coworkers in a virtual format quite unattractive. So to address this problem, and once our staff has been fully vaccinated, we would like to have a couple of employee engagement activities with the sole purpose of rebuilding our sense of identity. And so another particular challenge would be the difficulty in executing our journalistic work. Prior to the pandemic, we agreed to develop a couple of journalistic reports. However, the quality of the reports depended on the information gathered through face-to-face interviews with public servants from different institutions. Unfortunately, most of these institutions have been closed since March 2020, making the process of obtaining interviews much more complicated and time-consuming. We've had no option but to delay some of our journalistic reports, and given the current situation, we are trying to be much more conservative with respect to the time that needs to be allocated to this type of work. So those are only a few challenges that I wanted to mention. I'm looking forward to discussing many more during the rest of the event. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We're going to go over to Anna at PPF, but I do want to come back to that theme about team culture and team building, because I think that's something we're all struggling with. But Anna, over to you.
Thank you.
Aaron,
I'm going to actually continue
in your mic, just so you're...
Okay, I'll deal with that. Thanks, Jim.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah. So yeah, I want to continue a bit on that challenge, and thanks so much, Liliana, for already, I think covering one of the biggest challenges we have around, how do we return back to work in an office? I would like to focus a bit more on the retention question. And actually, I would say that we didn't have a retention issue in the last 15 months, right? Like everyone was pretty much staying where they are. And so I think partly that made us maybe a bit complacent. The issue I think that we now have is actually that people are tired. Everyone I think is very, very tired. And so we're worried about the retention challenge that we're all going to face going forward. Partly of that is, how do we manage the return to the office? But I think more importantly, like how do we manage, I think, some of the mental health challenges that I think came very apparent over the last few months. How do we manage, I think, the conversations around diversity, inclusion, and equity in the workplace? So again, I think a big question for us, and I think we don't have the answers, but I think we need to figure it out going forward. And I think those questions and how organizations are handling those will really depend then on our long-term ability to retain amazing talent in our organization. I think we all realized how much the human resource is our most valuable resource in the kind of organizations we have, and we're worried about that. We try to tackle some of it with, for example, just simple strategies like increasing mental health benefit packages. We really tried and think a lot about how can we create that sense of community and belonging to the workplace through, social get-togethers online. And of course, I think something Liliana already mentioned, how do we onboard new staff and how do we retain that staff? So these are, I think, some really big challenges, not only in the past 15 months, but more importantly, in a way going forward. Thank you.
No, that's a very good point. And, onboarding and retention are key issues. I actually asked one of my staff to join this meeting because could you imagine joining a new organization, especially a think tank, during a pandemic? Like, it's a very different thing because we don't build anything. We don't make widgets. And how do you work in a think tank? It's very tricky, but that's a good set of comments. Thank you for that. Eric, over to you, please.
Hey, good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to join you and participate in the panel. A little bit of background on the Heritage Foundation and how we weathered the pandemic over the last 18 months was we were able to keep our buildings open to staff almost since March. And so as conditions allowed it, we allowed staff the flexibility to work in the building. And it proved very beneficial for a lot of our team members, especially the young folks who may have been sharing an apartment with 2 or 3 roommates. The idea of gathering around a kitchen table day after day, week after week, did get a little tiresome. So working in an almost empty building at a certain point was maybe safer than working in the apartment and gave you more a better work environment. We also, for folks with had kids in the house and running around, and opportunity to get out of that environment and to work in the building in a more quiet place for concentrated work served us. And so Heritage implemented a 4-phase plan to progress out of the pandemic to return to regular operations. We published that plan last April, and we moved through it through last year. We opened up the building to outside events, to meetings. Most recently in May, we opened up to full normal regular operations here in Washington, D.C. at our Capitol Hill headquarters. The week after moving to regular operations, we had an on-site staff meeting. It was voluntary, and we had almost 200 people in attendance in an auditorium. And there was a reception that evening where we had well over 100 folks at that reception. We think we did pretty well. We gave staff, what worked for us, we gave staff flexibility. We, throughout the whole thing, allowed staff, provide them opportunities to work remotely, to work on site, and to make decisions that were in their best interest. And I think that kept morale really high. It kept staff focused on what they needed to do work-wise and to take care of their families. And so we think that from where the pandemic started to now, some easy decisions were made. For business decisions, it was easy to shut down when we were required to, and it was easy to require remote work. Moving forward, I think is the big challenges for us in the nonprofit world as we emerge out of here, as now we're writing new playbooks, new operating models, distributed workforces or on-site. Can we maintain the flexibility that staff learn to appreciate and form habits around? We're not going to be able to recreate those easy commutes and the free parking and maybe the business casual that some staff learn to enjoy long term. But as we start to move out of this, I think it's a really good opportunity for us in the think tank world to look what's in the best interest of our individual organization, how we're individually organized at the team level, at the enterprise-wide level, and not necessarily just follow what the business community is doing, because their operating models, their resources are substantially different from ours. So really looking at what's essential for your team, what is your secret sauce, what our secret sauce is, and not try to follow the leader. I think that's where we're focusing on moving forward.
Thanks for that, Eric. And I want to come back to this question of real estate, because I think there's a parallel set of challenges, right? There's the real estate footprint, and then there's staff that are going to want to pick and choose and come in here and sometimes there, and some people want to stay remote. And I mentioned in our prep call, CG has a 115,000 square foot building, and last week there was 2 of us in the office, right? And so obviously social distance is not a problem there. Okay, let's go over to Daniel. Daniel, please.
Hi, thanks very much. I'll answer in a little bit of a different direction, because I think I agree with everything that has already been said. I think the biggest challenge for us over 16 months that we recognized early on was that we for speed. And I'm sure that this is true of most of your institutions as well. We're used to mulling around an idea, sending it through multiple editors, getting it externally peer reviewed, then publishing it, then maybe we're doing a revised version of a working paper. Well, one of my colleagues estimated that the United States alone was losing between $30 and $36 billion in GDP per day as a result of COVID-related shutdowns. So time is absolutely of the essence. So we basically had to throw out all of our processes for developing research, publishing it, getting it out very early on in the pandemic. And our initial thought was this was something that we would 3 or 4 months. But what we've learned is that we operate at a speed that we previously didn't think that we would be able to, with as high a level of quality we expect of ourselves and the community expects of us. So the biggest challenge has turned out, I think, to be an opportunity that we've showed ourselves how to faster and how we can learn from each other more quickly, iterate more effectively, to get ideas and analyses out, not just in a matter of months, but in a matter of days and even hours. I think the biggest challenge for all of us going forward, and people have touched on a number of things, but I think that it would be remiss to ignore that we continue to undergo a challenge to the very business model of think tanks. For those of you who have not read Jonathan Rauch's new book, The Constitution of Knowledge, I strongly recommend it. It really points out a lot of the epistemic troubles of our time right now. Think tanks are, of course, epistemic liberal institutions, and the decline in faith in those institutions more broadly presents a challenge to us. So I think that the ready for us coming out of COVID to build on of what we've done effectively over the last couple of years, or the last 18 months, something that all of us are going to kind of get through separately.
Thanks, Daniel. That's an interesting point about switching your research process, because we do double-blind peer review on our flagship stuff, and it takes months and months to do that. So that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. Julie, over to you.
Thank you, Aaron. And thank you, Jim, for gathering the community for this important conversation. To think about where we need to go to meet all of the challenges that are us, I need to reflect a little bit about where we've been. When we went remote on March 13th of 2020, first and foremost was our concern for the health and safety of our staff and community. And in those early days, when we didn't understand just how long we'd be remote, we are really fortunate that a lot of our investment over the last 2 years on infrastructure allowed us to pivot quickly to remote work. Our finance and HR and IT systems were cloud-based, and all of our employees already had council-issued devices. And our cybersecurity protocols were fortified and ready for offsite work, given our usual amount of volume of travel that we had experienced during normal circumstances. From week one, we were hosting high-level virtual events, and we launched a financial risk assessment organization-wide. We targeted our donor stewardship in different ways to be sure that we remain connected to those supporting the council and our mission during this unexpectedly turbulent time. We actually had an 11% growth in revenue in 2020, and we were able to sustain our unrestricted funding, retain existing donors, and attract some new sponsors. And we doggedly addressed financial vulnerabilities each quarter, and this served us really well. We were also able to grow our team and attract new talent, and we increased by 16% since March of 2020, and we're projected to grow to 210 employees this year if we hire everyone we expect to. But our biggest area of growth may have been our events and convenings. We had 847 virtual events in 2020. That's a 32% increase over 2019, and we expanded our audience of event attendees by about 159%. So I'm really proud of what we've been able to accomplish while we've been remote, but as challenging as this was, as some of our other panelists have noted, the physical return to the office and hybrid events is infinitely more complex. So we've used this year of disruption as a year of innovation. We've demonstrated we can be effective, productive, connected, and financially strong while we work remote. And this adaptation really helps us to reimagine what the post-COVID-19 world may look like. And in this world, we've got to retain the best of the council and recognize that a return to normal would actually be the riskiest path forward. So while the playing field was level, while we were all remote, balancing demand for in-person collaboration and the flexibility expected for continued part-time remote work is complicated. We've proven that performance has not been diminished by remote work, but how are relationships going to be impacted when some staff are in the office, some are at home, and teams are rarely together? We've learned through our surveys and conversations that only a small percentage of our staff actually prefer to stay remote or relocate from the area. And we've implemented a new remote work policy that outlines the factors that must be met for someone to be granted full-time remote work. So the majority of our staff want to return to the office at least 3 days a week. And that's probably due to the fact that 60% of our staff is under 35 years old. And many of them are eager to physically return to build relationships and to grow professionally. We've allowed access to our office with proper screenings and reservations over the past few months, and we've hosted a number of high-level hybrid events with a mix of in-person and virtual speakers. So it's become increasingly clear that our stakeholders really miss the beating heart of our offices, where back-to-back convenings created a buzz. Our partners really want the casual exchanges before and after our convenings, and we're upgrading our meeting rooms and event spaces to allow for better hybrid collaboration and better broadcast quality events. Regarding real estate, we had already outgrown our office space pre-pandemic, and with our continued growth, we can actually only fit 85% of our staff in our workspace. But rather than rent additional space at this time, we're going to take this opportunity to reimagine why we use the office. There's never been a time in history like this, so we've got to push ourselves and see how we can best use less space and transition to a reservation-based hoteling model where no employees have dedicated offices or workspaces. This is a significant change to our culture. And we've taken a great deal of time to survey our staff, understand demands, manage expectations, and socialize our plans for the fall. So we're really viewing the fall as a pilot program in many ways, and we're going to use the analytics and data from our platform to analyze utilization and help us adjust. So what lies ahead for those in management of all workplaces is daunting, to say the least. So I'm eager to learn from the rest of the panelists, and I'm hopeful that we're all going to be able to return smarter and stronger and more resilient than ever as we navigate the next step.
Thanks for that, Julie. And Jim, I don't want to cast ahead to the program for next year, but I would love to hear Julie come back and let us know how the hoteling thing goes, because I know that's how tech companies are doing it. And I just wonder if it's going to transfer over to the think tank model. So there's some questions coming in, and I do want to get to the audience questions. And we have till about 9:50 together. So if you do have questions, please throw them in the chat now so I can see how many we have, so I can allocate the time between the speakers. But before doing that, let's go over to Karen. Karen, over to you.
Thanks. Thank you all for inviting me to this very esteemed meeting. As the Vice President of Human Resources, my focus has been on the staff. And at Center for American Progress, our staff had a very emotionally and mentally difficult year in 2020. On top of the pandemic and their concern for their own health and safety, it was an election year. There was a racial reckoning that happened in the United States. And the trauma of the 4 years of the previous administration was coming to a head. And so people were exhausted, they were upset most of the year, and it was difficult for people to maintain their level of energy and focus, but they did. In addition to that, they felt very committed, very passionate about making change in our country. And so that exhaustion and despair gave way to euphoria in January, and people were very excited about the changes that were happening and felt that all of our hard work had paid off. And so in conjunction with that, because of the expertise of our staff, many of our staff in January, February, March began leaving CAP and joining the new administration. And so after a very difficult year where people felt like they had really come together and accomplished their goals, then everybody started leaving. And so it's been a very tumultuous time. There's been a lot of uncertainty. There's been a lot of change at our organization. The biggest change that we are facing now is a change in leadership. Our president joined the new administration. We've been searching for a new one, and we anticipate that announcement will be made imminently. And so our staff is very much in a state of limbo right now. We are still working 100% remotely until after Labor Day. Right before the pandemic started in early 2020, we signed a new lease and started renovating our space. So we actually have a couple of things that we think will draw our staff back to the office in September. A new president to come and meet, and a new office space has been completely redesigned and reimagined. So people are really looking forward to that, but there's also a lot of uncertainty about what the future will hold, what our rules will be, how that will all work. And so we are trying to figure that out. I don't think we have all the answers now, but we certainly see this fall as a time to explore the new options, decide what the new expectations are going to be going forward, and then institutionalize them and move forward after that. Thanks.
Thank you for that. And I have a list of questions that I wanted to get to, but I think it more appropriate to turn to questions from the audience now. So I know I told you guys I was going to ask all these great questions, but I'm going to switch gears and go right to the audience questions. So the one coming in from Jim is, what are the major myths and misconceptions of the workplace and the workforce issues that have been shattered by COVID-19? So what I'll do first, I'm going to turn to my Canadian colleague first, and then I'm going to go over to Eric. So Anna, over to you.
Thanks so much, Aaron. Well, I think the first myth that has been shattered, that people work less when working from home. In fact, they work more. And I don't know, how much of that was a myth before, but I think there was definitely, concerns, that all of a sudden, or at least before, right, when working from home, do we actually get the same level of productivity? And I think that has been proven overall to be wrong. So people are actually, at least in our case, work a lot more. And in fact, even so, to a level that I think we're worried, right, around actually boundaries between, personal life and professional life, and people, all of that blurred too much. And I think people really actually, we needed to ask people to make sure that they have time off and that they actually eventually turn the computer and their phones off. So I think that has been shattered. I think the other one that has been confirmed, though, is I think this whole conversation around how important water cooler chat and in-person meetings, it means especially for think tank. And we're also in the business of convening and bringing people together. And it's really hard to replace. I still have to find or see the virtual or the digital tool that really does networking well. I think we all are really good in terms of knowledge transfer, and we have we've seen great events, but really kind of networking and connecting doesn't work so well. So those are the things that I think have been confirmed and or shattered from our perspective.
No, that's a fair point. And I'll come into my office to grab a book on a Sunday, and I'll look up, and I spent 2 hours at my computer. Like I've just automatically programmed to. So the work-life separation and the amount of hours that we're all clocking is certainly a key point. I'm going to go over to Eric and then to Liliana. Eric, please.
I would follow up kind of what Julie was saying, that if there was a myth that think tanks needed to convene meetings in person and that outreach, meetings, events favored the in-person, I think that myth was blown out as our numbers skyrocketed over the pandemic with our virtual gatherings, virtual meetings, multiple different levels, from big, formal, elaborate events that could be hosted online to just outreach to new audiences. Heritage has seen that our ideas have reached new audiences, younger people, people in different countries. Our ideas were much more accessible. The dialogue, the collaboration, the connectedness of these broader debates was very rich during the pandemic. And so I think from a cost effectiveness perspective to expanding the reach to new audiences, I think that we'll still favor or balance between the in-person and the virtual. I think there's a place for both moving forward.
And so I want to turn to Liliana, and a bit of a kind of a hot pursuit on what Eric said. Actually, one of the best meetings I ever went to was hosted by Ethos and Comexi in Mexico, and the meeting was good. The subject matter was good. It was engaging, but actually one of the best parts was getting to meet people and kind of spend time informally on the side. So how are you dealing with these two kind of bifurcated challenges of like keeping your audience engaged on the subject matter, but like keeping your colleagues in the world engaged? Oh, you're muted. So hold your brilliance until you unmute.
Thank you so much. I definitely think that Anna is right in terms of the events. We've had many virtual events, such as like webinars, roundtables, meetings. Actually, last year we had a 2-day anti-corruption summit, very similar to the Latin America Think Tank Summit that we had here in Mexico City a few years ago. And so we were able to have national and international representatives from different sectors. And in some of these virtual events, we were able to have very high-level experts that would have otherwise been more difficult to reach. So I would say that engaging with stakeholders has not been as difficult as networking has been. And I also think that in terms of the work, in Ethos, I would say that 90% of the personnel have been working much more. They have been more productive. I think that, for example, I didn't used to do this, but now I'm having breakfast in front of the computer, lunch and dinner, now that I don't have to commute for very long hours. So I'm spending that time working even more. So this is something that is happening to many members of the team. However, I mean, we would also have to add the fact that this adds a lot of stress to the team, right? So we have these two things where people are being more productive, but also people are being much more stressed. So perhaps we can talk about that later on.
Sure, and I thought you were going to go with the eating lunch in front of your computer, that you would have lunch with colleagues. And one of the bizarrest experiences I've had over the pandemic is I actually bought lunch for my staff, and I had Ubers all time to go to their houses. Sitting and eating a salad in front of your computer, talking to people on Zoom, is a bizarre experience. I mean, it is not a good approximation of sitting down and having a meal with people.
Actually, Aaron, I just wanted to say that we did that for Christmas dinner, and it was a good experience.
Okay, cool. All right, well, I stand corrected. Daniel, over to you.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have a lot to add to what's already been said. say kind of the way that we're thinking about this going forward is that in terms of how you split up time between being at home and being in the office, it basically is a collective action problem that where we're hearing similarly to what all of you are saying, that people want some time together apart. And we're fortunate here in that it's a problem that we've been dealing with for almost 10 years now, because we have off on George Mason University's both main campuses. The smaller of our two offices, Thursday had just kind of evolved into being the focal day in that office. And that's because that's when guest profs typically come in to speak, and that's when graduate student programs are. So that's typically the day that I spent there. That's the day that everyone just kind of knows to come in. You know, Thursday is the day that you'll be able to see office. The other days will be relatively quiet. So on our other campus, what we're doing, we're buying lunch for people on alternating Tuesdays. And we're just trying to make Tuesday the focal day. But we'll see if that sticks. But ultimately, I'm convinced whatever comes out of here is going to be some kind of emergent order. It's not going to be something I and our COO decide what the rules are going to be. Will be different between teams. It'll be different between campuses. And then I think that our plan is basically just whatever kind of the emergent phenomenon is, assuming that works for people. So it's very small d democratic in that people are going to have to decide what it is that they want to participate in that schedule. Excited about seeing what comes out of this.
Thank you for that. And let's go to Julie next. Julie, please.
So I think I mentioned earlier that we're really looking at the fall post-Labor Day as a pilot program in so many ways. We've spent so much time planning. We've spent so much time researching. You can't keep up with the amount of information coming at you with studies and surveys and ways to think about the hybrid workforce. We've got a lot of plans and a lot of ideas, and they're either going to work or they're not. Whenever we all get back in September. So I think that, you know, as a workplace, I think people are going to need to be kind to each other. I think that people are eager to get back, and some of the most gratifying moments that you have with your colleagues, I think people are really going to be looking forward to that. But I think there are going to be challenges with how you manage a couple of people in a room and a couple of people on screen, and how's that interaction going to be equitable? You know, and externally with stakeholders and meeting participants, you know, how do you create an environment that feels equally as good for the people on Zoom as the people in the room? So I think that I agree that we're going to learn a lot, and we're going to need to continue to adapt, and what's about to come is not going to be easy. But I think that we can all continue to learn from each other and figure out ways to continue to adapt in this next big part of the experiment.
For sure, actually. And another challenge on the hybrid model is going to be making sure that your lines of communication work. Because if we're all virtual, there's a way of communicating. If we're all in the office, you're walking down the hall talking to people, chatting at the water cooler, as you say. But how is it going to work when there's half in and half out? Let's go over to Karen.
One of the real changes I saw, and that I think a lot of us experience, is there used to be this separation between work life and personal life. And when you're working from home, you're working at home, your home life is your work life, is your home life is your work life, and it's all mushed together. My grandparents were farmers, and they were farmers, and they lived on the farm, and they farmed, and they lived their lives, and it was all intertwined. And in office environments, there's this mentality that you're at work from 9 to 5 and then you're at home in the evening. And we saw a lot of staff whose hours and work times changed and evolved, because especially people with kids and families that they needed to take care of. If you're homeschooling your kids in the morning, maybe you're working from 8 to 10 in the evening. Or if you're taking somebody to a doctor's appointment, then you get up early and do something early in the morning. And so I think the idea of work is a 9 to 5 thing really changed. And I agree with Anna, a lot of people ended up working just all the time because their computer was right there and they could. But it wasn't really 20 hours a day. It was some hours a day sprinkled throughout the time that they were awake. And it was, you work some, you take a break, you work some, you do something else. And so I think that is a much more natural rhythm for people to get things done. And I think a lot of people found it very productive to be able to step away from work and take care of what they needed and then get back to it. And I hope that doesn't completely go away and that people continue to have that sort of flexibility instead of being stuck in the rigid 9 to 5.
No, that's really helpful. And
Sure.
oh, sorry, go ahead, please.
So I just wanted to build on that. The one thing I think that is really interesting in this is that actually I think we saw really improvement in terms of disability inclusion actually in the workplace, right? So I think because of that more flexibility and how people could work, we saw that especially, for non-visible disabilities, I think people in the workplace overall felt that they were much better accommodated for the first time ever.
Yeah, and that's a point that we can't lose sight of. So we have about 7 minutes left together, and I think I want to come to the heart of the issue now. And I want to turn to the panelists, and I want you to give me 2 recommendations of things that we as institutions, as an industry, as colleagues, 2 things that we have to do, that we must do in the coming months and years. And I'll give you a bit of time to breathe because I'll give you mine, and I'm actually going to break my own rules, and I'll give you 3. Number 1, we have to be prepared to question our own assumptions. Number 2, like Daniel did, we have to be prepared to question our own processes. Why should it take 3 months to get a good idea into the marketplace of ideas? And number 3, we have to be prepared to be wrong as leaders and to correct our mistakes if we see them coming. So I'm going to go in alphabetical order just to give you all fair warning. Liliana, over to you. What are the 2 things? We have to learn how to unmute ourselves whenever we're in a big meeting.
Sorry. I would say that we will have to learn how to work around funding reduction. That would be something that would be very important for certain think tanks in certain regions, maybe not the US and Canada. And I also think that we have to get closer to the team, to the staff, and learn about the difficulties during this whole pandemic, learn about their anxieties, learn about their discomforts, learn about their problems. I think those would be my 2 recommendations.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Anna, over to you.
I think my first one is we need to be really good at experimenting and learning from it and continuously learning, right? And I think we've heard that throughout already. But how can we make that in a way as a mode of working a bit more? Testing, okay, doesn't work, let's do something else, and kind of throw a bit, as you just said, some of the assumptions out the window. That's the one. The second one is I think, how do we build a resilient and engaged workforce after this, or continue maybe to build? And what does resilience for an organization actually mean? And I think some of that has to do, with around how do we rally around the purpose and the values of our organizations, and how do we communicate those to staff, and how do we listen to staff, what they actually want, as we're experimenting and changing our ways. So I think it'll be a much more agile model going forward.
Yeah, for sure, because it's fail fast and reset, right? And also engage your staff continually because there's a whole dynamic there. Eric, please.
Totally agree with that. Number 1 is the innovation and the experimentation, the reworking, the business model. I think it works if it's bottom up. I think the C-suite thinking that they have all the best ideas and really know what the workforce needs, I think could be misguided. I really think it has to be bottom up from the different aspects of the organization and not just favor, one department over another. And 2 would be not to try to fully package this prematurely, have everything thought out and pre-baked and then done in one package. This is there's sort of iterations to this. It's a long-term outlook of where we're headed. And so I think as we experiment and reimagine our organizations, I would focus on, a series of what do we need in the next 6 months or next year? And it's okay to have a little bit of gray area on making some permanent changes, but leading the team through some experimentation and let's try this out, I think would work best. For some of us, we haven't gone back yet, and we're already pre-imagining and prescribing what that will look like long term. So I think a little bit, slow down a little bit in the long term decision making.
Just through the here and the now. Daniel, over to you.
I think the first thing is on the talent challenge. I think we have to think about that differently. It's not just enough to have experienced, educated people, they have to be people who can be really innovative, really drive programs, try new things, be more entrepreneurial than I am, and than many of us who have adapted to this community are. And then the second thing, and I think it flows from that, is Lingo is projects, not programs. We're not interested in building up programs that will necessarily look 5 or 10 years into the future what they look like now. We want to spin up projects. We want it to have effect if they're going to generate new knowledge. And then on a 6-month or 1-year basis, we make it on whether we're going to get a strategy or go somewhere else with it. So it's just a much faster decision-making timeline in a lot of the ways that we make investments.
No, that's a good point. I had our security research. One of my colleagues heads our economic stuff. You show me the line between cybersecurity and the economy now, and I'll buy you a coffee the next time I see you. Julie, over to you.
So I think that if I had to pick two things, we've got to intentionally create an environment that's equitable for those who are remote and those who are physically present, to be sure that people have the same chances for career advancement, that people have the same chances to be heard and to be seen in the workplace. And then secondly, we've got to be agile and ready to take chances and continue to adapt with innovative new ways of engaging with internal and external audiences, new ways to work, and new tech and new platforms that continue to emerge.
Thank you. Karen.
I think we have to intentionally work on building trust with our staff, between and among us, because there is so much uncertainty, and we have seen with our staff a lot of anxiety around the uncertainty of what the future holds. And if staff trust that we're going to make good decisions for them, then it relieves a lot of their anxiety. And we need to do a better job of building that trust and being very intentional about that. And then in general around employees, I think some of the others have said it, learning to better address mental health issues and learning to manage people as they best need to be managed, because we've seen all the norms fall to the wayside, and in this new environment, figuring out how to best manage employees so they can be most productive in the way that they need is something that's going to be really important going forward.
Well, thank you to the panelists for an exceptional conversation. You'll note that I was very careful with the time. One of the reasons behind that is because the next panel is chaired by my good friend and colleague, Andrew Seeley, who's actually one of my favorite people from the think tank world. So I wanted to make sure he had as much time as possible. Jim, back to you.
Okay, we have moved Andrew. He is no longer the chair. He has been deposed, and his former colleague Duncan Wood will be the chair, and Andrew will be a panelist, and so it worked out very well, but there is that change that I want to note for everyone. I just want to point out that what I think captures what was so eloquently laid out by our colleagues. One is a biased sample. These are institutions, and I think we have to be clear, who have been successful and ahead of the curve in terms of these issues. And we have to keep in mind those countries, those institutions around the world, both in the North America and around the world, that have not made this transition. The clear thing is that COVID accelerated and intensified trends that were already in play. And those institutions that were smarter, better, faster, more agile, more adaptive, more digital, survived very well, and that is why this is a biased, non-representative sample of think tanks globally. And part of the purpose of this is to help the entire community by the excellent ideas that were shared by the panel. I'm very pleased to turn now to the final panel that will be chaired by Duncan Wood from the Wilson Center. And I should say that virtually everyone who's on the panel and on the planning committee have been very reliable and supportive partners over the years. And certainly the Wilson Center has been one of them. So Duncan, I turn it over to you, and the focus now is on a mandate for leadership and change and innovation in terms of think tanks, the overall theme for this summit, and what we've heard, what some of the issues that we need to focus on from the first panel. We've heard the operational challenges in the second panel. We really want to hear from your panel in terms of what we should do. What are the priorities, both in terms of policy and operational from their standpoint? What are the specific concrete things that we need to do? And so I turn this unenviable task over to you and to the panel. Duncan.
Thanks a lot, Jim, and good morning, everybody. It's great to be able to participate in these sessions, Jim. If for nothing else, that we get to see old friends that we haven't seen in a while, and former colleagues, folks that we used to hang out with at conferences. I was particularly delighted to see that Liliana was on the previous panel. At one point, she was a student of mine, and despite that, she's been successful. So I'm very, very happy to be able to see her as one of our esteemed colleagues these days. As you say, Jim. We are going to try to bring this home for you in a meaningful way. We've got a panel de lujo, a luxurious panel in many ways, because we've got a managing director, a CEO, and a president on this final panel. We're talking about the mandate for leadership, common purpose, and change. We're trying to discuss how do we forge a consensus about creating a better future. What is the role of the think tank world in that? And I'd just like to make a little sort of, it's not a personal note, it's a professional note here. Yesterday, the Wilson Center hosted its first hybrid event. We worked for months to put this together. We decided to make it a private invitation-only event so that we could control the parameters a little bit better. And I have to say that, thanks to the extraordinary work of our AV team and our external relations people, we were able to pull off a terrific event celebrating the first anniversary of the USMCA. And although it's not entirely seamless yet, it's another signal that there is light at the end of the tunnel, and that folks coming back together in the room can interact in a meaningful way with folks outside of the room. And so, I wanted to put that out there because it's something that we've worked very, very hard on, and it's been a priority for our leadership. So let me introduce our panelists. And if I may, I will begin, first of all, with Brian Lee Crowley, Managing Director of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, Canada. I'd then like to introduce old colleague of mine, dear friend, Andrew Seeley, President of the Migration Policy Institute here in the US. And another great friend of ours, Valeria Moy, CEO of IMCO in Mexico. Panelists, you know what the job is here, so I'm going to give you 5 minutes to begin with your first take on these issues of leadership, common purpose, change, and forging consensus. And I'm going to come back to you afterwards and ask you some questions about what in fact we mean by any one of those terms. So why don't we begin with you, Valeria, and then we'll work backwards to Andrew and then to Brian.
Thank you, Duncan. Thank you, Andrew. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Well, let me tell you a little bit about how I took IMCO. I was appointed the chairman or CEO or whatever you want to name it of IMCO last year during July, almost 1 year ago. During the pandemic, I moved from managing a team of 3 people, including myself, to managing a team of 36 people whom I didn't know. I mean, I had seen a couple of them like in real life, but that I didn't know personally. So suddenly I was in charge of leading a very large team of 36 people that had different issues, different topics, that were addressing different ideas and that were working on many different things. I used to head a think tank that was very specialized in economic policy. So everybody was an economist. Well, everybody, the 3 of us were economists, and we always had the same mindset in a way. And suddenly I had to start dealing with things regarding climate change or government issues or public finance or health or education or women issues. So it became a huge change. And what I realized very, very soon is that this whole team were like in desperate need of leadership. They wanted somebody like to guide them. And that was very difficult to do, like from a Zoom environment or from an online environment. People wanted to know if the studies that they were doing on climate change were like the relevant issues that IMCO would pursue forward. They wanted to know if the public finance studies that they were doing were going to be the most relevant area of IMCO now, from now onwards. So it suddenly became very difficult, and it became even more difficult, and this will probably sound very not politically correct, but it became more difficult with the younger members of the team. The younger members of the team were not used, I mean, they would say that they were used to working from home, they were used to use a computer, they were used to working at different times, but they were the most prone to very intense mental issues. I wouldn't go to severe mental issues, but they were very prone to depression, they were very prone to anxiety. So for me, being in charge of this very large team, I used to talk to the directors, and the directors themselves used to talk with their teams. And suddenly I realized that this hierarchy, I don't know how to pronounce that, of the way we were trying to deal with these issues wasn't working. The younger part of the team wanted to talk to me. The younger members of the teams wanted to talk to me specifically about the importance of their own work. So we have to know that we're dealing with different generations that have a very different take on technology, that have a very different take on the ways on their personal relationships. They have a very different take on the way leadership should work. So for me, it has been a whole year of full learning. I have been learning a lot, and we're starting to do this very small, very tight, presential or real life meetings again. And that has proven incredibly helpful. Starting to meet people for the first time in 1 year. But it has been incredibly helpful. And the other thing that you were mentioning, Duncan, and that's the topic of this panel, is the common sense. The common sense or the common purpose for the think tank or for the area or the directions that we are looking. IMCO had different areas, but we need a common area. We need something to hold us together as a team. We need a glue. And what I'm trying to do at IMCO right now is, I don't know if this is helpful for the other think tanks, but I think the idea of rebuilding, of starting not from zero, but in some cases from zero, and starting to build again, and break all these ideas that everything is going terribly bad and the country is falling apart, and COVID and the deaths. And I mean, if you're from Mexico, you can see that many things are happening at this point in time. And there's this, as Keynes would say, animal spirit that everything is going terribly. And I think we have to change that mindset. And we as leaders have to guide that change. Otherwise, it won't happen. So that's what I'm trying to do from IMCO, trying to focus on, we have to rebuild. We have to think, we have to propose, and we have to take advantage of this very privileged job that we have, that is think. We have to take advantage of that and propose new ideas to guide the country to a better place.
Thank you, Valeria. Excellent points. I love the point about the generational challenge within think tanks, because particularly for older white dudes like myself, it's very, very difficult to get out of that mindset sometimes. And most of it, as you suggest, is actually about being there, listening, and understanding the difference in thinking. I love your points about needing a glue to hold everybody together in that common purpose. I'd love to come back to that in the question and answers as well. But let's go over to Andrew Seeley. Andrew, great to see you there. Your take on this call for action.
Hey, Duncan. Great to see you. And thank you, Jim, for bringing us all together. It's so great to see so many good friends and colleagues at this summit. Wish we were all together. And I guess that comes to my first point, which is, we are together and we're not together, right? I mean, this is our hybrid universe. I'm sitting in the new offices of the Migration Policy Institute, feel very proud about this. Beautiful windows, great workspace, collaborative areas. We just moved and we created this space, and there are two of us in the office right now enjoying this space. We're just about to open up next week to allow people to come in, but my guess is it's going to take a while before we come back. we could lament that. Certainly, we've lost a little bit of the water cooler talk. We've lost the chance to, sit at this summit. I see Andrew Marshall over there. Would love to pull you aside, Andrew, and catch up. And great Aaron. One of my favorite people to talk with. Also, all the time, always learn so much from you. Would love to have a corner conversation. Or Valeria. We haven't seen each other for a while. But on the other hand, we are together, and I think there's something we're about to try and do in about an hour. Our first hybrid event, like Duncan did yesterday and the Wilson Center did yesterday. We're only doing 10 people, and 3 of us will be in person, and the rest will be on video. It's sort of like going back to the gym. This is like our first attempt. We're going to lift 2 weights and then leave. But, this is our chance to do something small. I think we've actually gained something in this period. One thing we gained is, I think, work-life balance. I don't think very many of us will ever be in the office 5 days a week again. I think we will learn how, and Julie said this earlier, I think we've learned that we can balance things in different ways. Other people on the previous panel said this in different ways. We've learned we can balance our life in multiple ways, and I think that's good. And so on one hand, really glad to have an office that people will enjoy working in, and also really glad that they're not going to be here all the time. I think we should celebrate both of those things, both wanting to have some spaces where we can meet up, but also also having greater flexibility in our lives. We have 2 offices. We have an office in Brussels. And so one of the things that's been fabulous over the past year and a half is actually spending more time with our colleagues from Brussels, who have never been more integrated in our life before. We have colleagues in Sacramento and San Antonio and New York who we would not have seen as much. And, maybe they would call into a meeting. Now they're fully part of our daily life. And so I think one of the challenges going forward is how do we keep what we gained during this period, what we learned to do in terms of being able to do meetings with people from everywhere, where everyone is in sort of equal circumstances, and at the same time return to some of the immediacy of in-person meetings. And that probably means hybrid structures, hybrid meetings. With our board, we've talked about doing, 1 meeting a year where we expect everyone to be together. We can have dinner together, but other meetings being more flexible on who comes. I think for a lot of our research projects, we'll do it that way. Launch events are probably better done by Zoom or in a hybrid model. But if you're going to do problem solving, maybe you want people in the same room at least once to do that. I mean, we're going to have to learn how to do this in many ways. One of the things that it's helped with also is I think it's made us less of an elite institution. And this is something many of us have talked about during, at different points. Jim, I know we've talked about this. I mean, one of the great challenges of think tanks is even when we try not to be elite institutions, particularly those of us that are sitting in capital cities like Mexico City or Washington or Ottawa, Toronto, you can take your pick in Canada, the sort of, official capital and economic capital, or New York in the US. I mean, we tend to become institutions that draw on the same crowd over and over again, right? And there's a cost for other people coming in and joining our conversation or even bringing in new voices. Well, one of the things we've found in the past 16 months is we can bring in new voices much more easily through video, right? I mean, it is much easier. It's much easier for other people to access what we do. I don't think we want to lose that. I think this has actually been a huge opportunity to broaden who we engage with, and hopefully we carry that going forward. Let me go into 2 substantive issues and I'll end. Or actually 1 substantive issue with 2 parts and I'll end, which is to say, I think we started off in the first panel with John Allen and Rohinton talking about how this has been a turning point in history, how it has accentuated many of the things we've seen, including inequality. I think one of our challenges going forward is we know that there are more that there will be more health challenges coming and more pandemics coming. How do we begin to think of resilience? And it is a place where think tanks can play an enormous role in beginning to think about what happens next time and what do we do to prepare. And along the way, how does this help us with also the present? So we're looking at this from our migration side. We've been looking at this in borders and mobility. My colleague Megan Benton is leading a whole area of work with IOM around questions of border and mobility. How do we manage borders better as we reopen? But also, how do we think of pandemic proofing? Shut everything down next time around, and how do we begin to think about this so we are much more flexible? But this is of course true in healthcare. How do we expand healthcare? We've looked a little bit at immigrants in healthcare. How does a country like Peru or Colombia or the United States look at incorporating immigrant talent that is not always licensed but has healthcare knowledge into the healthcare system at a time of crisis? But there are lots of opportunities in the healthcare system to think about how we can be more resilient. How can we be more resilient in education so that kids don't lose a year of schooling? How are we more resilient in our economy so we don't have to shut everything down? Or if we do it in a way that does the least damage to people's jobs. thinking through all of those challenges, you know, and we find a way to buffer it for people who suffer the most and lose jobs or lose income. We need to start thinking about those things now. Think tanks play a role in thinking of all these challenges in creative ways so we're not caught by surprise again, because this is happening before long. In fact, we may see a pandemic that sort of rolls on in and out a little bit for the next year, right? And so, but certainly there'll be future pandemics coming. And finally, this leads me to a point that Celia Toro made on the first panel, which is North America. You know, and I know Duncan cares a great deal about this as someone who's lived in all three countries of Canada, the United States, and Mexico, and many of the rest of you do as well. You know, does this recover a sense of being a North American enterprise? I actually have thought we've been losing that for a while, that there's been a loss of interest in what it means to be part of these three countries that live near each other. But I think that may be changing as a result of the pandemic. The reality is, you know, making decisions on borders, there has been an active discussion on borders between Canada and the U.S. and the U.S. and Mexico, but also vaccines. You know, what do we do in terms of supporting each other down the road? You know, maybe this is wishful thinking, but I think there's some elements that could give us a bit of hope in thinking that there may be a moment we can take advantage of here where we're once again thinking about what it means to be a North American community, not just in the think tank world, but beyond that. And what do we do with that? Because when times of crisis like this pandemic and this global economic crisis hit us, we're all in this together. And part of the solution has to be working together to come out of it as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Andrew. And just to take you up on that last point, you know, we're working heavily at the Wilson Center right now on the idea of America's supply chains, and the goal was to create a project that was really global in focus, to look at global supply chains. We keep coming back to the region, to North America, and sort of a little bit further North America, Central America, the Caribbean. But these are the subjects that keep coming up because of where we are right now at this particular moment in history. Brian, I'm going to come over to you. You and I are not friends yet, but we will be after this panel, and hopefully we'll be able to hang out very, very soon. Why don't you give us your take on this call for action? I think you're muted, Brian.
There we go.
There you go.
Thank you so much for the introduction and for the to be here. Jim McGann said the purpose of today's event is to outline why there is a state for leadership, common purpose, and change in a post-pandemic world. My view is that there is no such mandate. On the contrary, COVID has demonstrated that the cool, dispassionate, comprehensive, and science-based knowledge of experts, including think tankers, is largely a myth. And much of the argument for the mandate that should be given to expertise relies on the idea that we know what we need to know in order to act intelligently. In other words, it's based on a presumption of knowledge. The baseline condition of humanity, including experts, however, is that we are ignorant and not knowledgeable. Knowledge is scarce and not abundant. And the knowledge we possess, including the knowledge about how to respond to viral outbreaks, is always and unavoidably partial and imperfect. And this is doubly true when you consider that each outbreak is going to have unique characteristics, and the virus itself may be, as COVID is, fast evolving, presenting policymakers with a moving target. Did expertise save us during the coronavirus outbreak? No. Sure, there were lots of experts peddling their expertise around the world, but we soon found that equally credible experts were often offering diametrically opposed advice and denouncing each other venomously as defectors from the consensus, which is about as unscientific a stance as I can imagine. Some experts' advice was followed in some places, and it worked out well, as in Taiwan. In other places, experts' advice was followed with less impressive results. And the Taiwan example shows, of course, that sometimes expert advice works out quite well until it doesn't. The policy that was followed did not come about because policymakers had to acquiesce in some expert consensus. There was no such consensus, and there still isn't such a consensus today, 18 months into COVID. Mostly what happened was that policymakers listened to people who sounded convincing and had the policymaker's ear. In the event, their advice was sometimes correct, sometimes not, and sometimes simply neither particularly helpful nor harmful. Only when the crisis is fully past, when it is too late to be of much use, Will we really be able to sort out what was most helpful? Then, when the next pandemic strikes, the lessons from COVID will be trotted out by the experts, when the state of our knowledge will again be partial and imperfect, and COVID may be more or less relevant. There is a reason why generals always fight the last war, because that's what they're expert on. And it's important to dwell for a moment on the extent to which the public policy response to COVID relied to an enormous extent on what I've described as the presumption of ignorance, not knowledge. Governments and private donors didn't give to some single government lab, not even the mighty CDC, no matter how many experts they employed, the job of isolating the virus, analyzing it, discovering the best way to test for it, developing a vaccine, or testing all the existing pharmaceutical agents against the virus to see if any of them worked. Instead, resources intended to hasten the discovery of COVID-related knowledge were handed to many public and private labs around the world, who then tried a bunch of different things in the hope that some of them would work. Different researchers, in effect, competed with each other to try and find the most effective therapeutic agents, or to design, test, and produce an effective vaccine, or produce cheap and quick testing kits. And that's the exact opposite of the pretension that experts have the answers to COVID or poverty or climate change, and it is only the obtuse resistance of the rest of us that is preventing them from making our lives better. All of the strategies and others that I have not mentioned are necessary because of the partial state of our knowledge, and because the vaunted expertise of those advising governments on their response to the crisis is impotent outside their extremely narrow area of knowledge. Now, there's nothing new in this. I'm merely pointing out that the pandemic has done absolutely nothing to make the case for rule by experts any stronger than it was before. It has merely confirmed the already well-known weakness of that case. And if we substituted climate change, for example, for COVID in my remarks, the argument would be exactly the same. As for the notion that we should generalize from the alleged social solidarity of the COVID crisis and apply its methods to resolving a host of other issues, my view is this is a vain hope. Why? Well, think about the similar phenomenon after the end of the Second World War. In Britain, 6 years of rationing and bombing and shortages and solidarity led the Labour Party to promise to carry that spirit and those methods into running peacetime society. Their slogan in the 1945 general election, which they won in a landslide, was, "And now win the peace." What they failed to realize was that war and peace are not the same thing. In the war, there was an overriding existential objective to which all else was voluntarily subordinated by the vast majority of Britons, and that was to defeat Hitler. When peace arrived, however, people quickly tired of overweening officials telling them what to do in the name of the spirit of Dunkirk. The public chafed increasingly under the privation of peacetime rationing. Above all else, they craved a return to normality, by which they meant a state of affairs where they made their own decisions about what mattered to them. Without the shared overriding goal of victory in war, social solidarity rapidly comes to be seen for what it is: license for bureaucrats to order people around in accordance with other people's ideas, mostly those of experts who are going to fix society's problems. If it only took a year or two for people to begin to find the spirit of Dunkirk an increasingly empty rallying cry, my guess is that the COVID outbreak and our response will prove even more evanescent. Many people love the idea that everyone else will drop their stubborn attachment to their selfish priorities and sacrifice their narrow vision for the common good. But what they usually really have in mind is that the rest of us will give up what we want and pursue what they want instead. The fact of the matter is that outside times of rare crisis like war or epidemic, we do not have a common set of concrete objectives on which we agree. And yet it is a consensus on overriding objectives that is the indispensable condition of social cooperation on a large scale imposed from above. The responses to most crises cannot be replicated once the crisis is over. And my prediction, and I'll finish on this, Duncan, my prediction is that people will be astonished at how quickly Canadians, in any case, I can't speak for anybody else, will want to return to the status quo anti-COVID, precisely because the default condition of humanity is ignorance, not knowledge. Human beings are condemned to learn, including from pandemics. We will just not learn what the fans of expert rule hope we will learn. Thanks very much.
Brian, I'm glad I left you till last. You've provided a very provocative take on this. I want to give Andrew and Valeria a chance to respond to it in a second. I also want to give you full credit for using the spirit of Dunkirk, which, one of my favorite places to visit, to be honest with you. Jim has put a question here in the chat, and I encourage the rest of our participants to send their questions through to the chat. Jim has asked, what about the policy challenges and the mandate for leadership, common purpose and change? What are the issues, public policies projects where we can agree and get something done and be part of the solution and not part of the problem? And I'd like to ask a very basic question, which I think that one of the things that the pandemic has exposed for us is, what is it that we actually do? Are we trying to get the word out to as big a public as possible? Or are we trying to really impact policy? And there are some organizations that do both. There are some organizations, many new organizations we've seen over the past 18 months who've just emerged. Anybody with a webcam can suddenly hold a Zoom conference. And, we're celebrating the fact that we're reaching wider audiences. But I want to ask the question, the very tough question, is that what we're actually
My camera's on. I can see the sticky note. I'm trying to figure out.
I can see your sticky note as well. And, I'm glad about that. But let me go over Valeria. Respond to Brian if you want to, or any of the questions from Jim or myself.
Well, actually, Duncan, one of the things that IMCO has in mind is how do we balance this thing of having to go to the public arena or to the public debate and be on top of things and, being part of the discussion of what is going on in Mexico or even in the world. And then you have to have your time, you have to have people, you have to have the human capital that has to be very much focused on thinking long-term initiatives or long-term studies or long-term analysis. And it has proven to be a very difficult equilibrium because at one point in time, I don't know, I'm sorry that I'm going to talk about Mexican specifics, but maybe you know that the Mexican president gives a daily morning conference. So when the president speaks every single morning, he puts the agenda, he sets the agenda. So everybody, including think tanks, feel kind of obliged. I don't know why, but we feel kind of obliged to respond. So if the Mexican president starts talking about civil society, because he often does, we feel compelled to go and raise our hand and give our opinion and let's talk about this. And at some point in time, you have to question yourself, is this what we're supposed to do? Are we set to respond or to reply to the president, to whatever he's talking or whatever he decided to talk that specific morning? Or we should keep a lower profile and, keep on working on the issues that we care about. And you know what? It's a very difficult balance because, for example, at IMCO, we have the mandate of the board. And the board wants IMCO to play a very public role. So when you have that mandate of your own board of directors that you have to play a public role and you have to be there, you have to be in the discussion, you have to put out there ideas to contrast or to tackle what the president is saying, it makes you very difficult. It makes the balance very difficult because you have to be able to reply, and then you have to be able to focus on serious things, or at least in medium or long-term analysis that you're trying to do. And that balance, I have no answer specifically, Duncan. I don't know what to do because at IMCO, I'm in that daily balance. It's a very thin line that we're crossing every single day. So the question is pertinent, and I'm sorry I don't have an answer.
And Valeria, particularly tricky for you when you have a president there who makes his morning statements with the express purpose of getting you to respond to them. That's exactly it. Yeah, he's laying a trap for people every single day.
And we fall every single day.
Andrew, over to you.
Yeah, I found Brian's remarks provocative. I have to say I draw a different conclusion from the pandemic. So I would say, there's few more proofs of the importance of expertise than the fact that we were able to develop, and I use the royal we because I had nothing to do with it, but it was possible for those with greater scientific knowledge than me and medical knowledge than me to develop vaccines in record time in multiple countries around the world and to begin to distribute them, right? I mean, I think that is an impressive accomplishment. The fact that we started off knowing very little about how COVID was spread. We were wiping down. I mean, I remember, standing in a bathroom joking with other people that we were all washing our hands for 30 seconds because that was the only thing we knew how to do, and realizing that was actually, yes, it's good to wash your hands for lots of reasons. I'm not telling you not to, but wearing a mask was more important, right? That actually was important, that being outside was safer than being inside, that there were things we could begin to parse out here, which expertise matters. I do think expertise matters. And if anything, I think we've actually come back to a point at the end of COVID where there may be a reaffirmation of expertise mattering without, and maybe this is what Brian's cautioning us on, without thinking that our expertise is all knowing, right? With knowing that our expertise is also vulnerable to error, it's vulnerable to value judgments that shape us in one direction or another. It's vulnerable to noise. It's vulnerable to lots of bias, to lots of things, and that part of the role we play is not only being ourselves trying to think of our great, brilliant ideas, but also challenging our own ideas against other people who we respect, and other people who may have very different ways of looking at the world, so that we begin to have more nuanced understandings. Right. And I think that is one role that think tanks should play is how do you bring together people who actually see the world differently and are able to challenge, either add different pieces of the puzzle or challenge the perspectives that we have and some of the preconceptions we have, so that expertise develops not because someone's got a PhD behind their name or they worked in a particular government job at some point or they wrote a great book. I mean, all which are valuable and good things, by the way, but also because we're sourcing it from multiple places, right? And that is a role that we can play as think tanks. And with that, I think to Duncan's point and Jim's question, I think one of the things that we learned, one of the early conferences that we did this year, I mean, it was a private meeting that ended up being about 90 people. And I don't know if it's still a private meeting when it's 90 people, but we were able at a time where there was a new administration trying to figure out what to do, vis-a-vis policy on migration with Mexico and Central America, to pull together a very broad number of people. We thought we were going to do 20, it ended up being 90, but it included people from governments in I think 5 or 6 countries, plus people from think tanks, plus people from community-based organizations, plus people from business groups. We missed people we should have included. We included people we probably should have missed. I mean, it wasn't a perfect exercise, but for me, it was a reminder that sometimes you can, in this environment, if you're smart, you can bring, if you're smart and strategic about it, you can bring together collections of people who all have different pieces of the puzzle that otherwise might not be in the, we often are talking about Central America and Washington, and it's a bunch of Americans sitting around the table talking about it, right? Or we're talking about government policy and it's a bunch of government people sitting around, or it's a bunch of think tank people or academics sitting around. The more we can source knowledge from different functional backgrounds, different country backgrounds, different ethnic and racial backgrounds, different generational backgrounds. What Jim said at the beginning of the conference, right? I mean, diversity is strategically important. It's not only desirable for some sort of normative reason, it's strategically important because it's what helps us put the pieces of the puzzle together in new ways. And what I think the virtual world has done for us is allow us to do this in broader and more agile ways. We still have to combine that with in-person meetings where we can go much deeper, right? And we can meet people and we can build different connections. But somewhere between that breadth and the ability to do greater depth maybe lies the answer on how you build expertise that's truly meaningful.
Thank you,
Duncan.
Andrew.
Duncan,
convening is critically important there, absolutely. It's a central part of what we do. And answering that question of developing a sense of common purpose. Brian, I'm going to leave you the last word on this panel.
Sure. Well, look, I think that some very important points were just made. Let me clarify a bit exactly what I had in mind. I would not for a moment deny the value of expertise, say, in creating vaccines. This is absolutely essential. The argument that I was that there is a difference between the application of expert knowledge to narrow problems which your expertise is directly related to, like the creation of vaccines, That's one thing. It's a completely different proposition to say that there are experts who know enough to be able to get up to the top of society and manage our efforts from this great apex based on their knowledge, that they know more about our society and our objectives and our what's important to us than we know ourselves. This is the key distinction. And what I said in my talk was that reflect for a moment on the vaccine example. If the expertise, the idea that there are people who have enough knowledge to be able to get up to the apex of society and organize everybody else's activities because of their superior knowledge, they would simply say, okay, what lab in the world has the best knowledge about vaccines? And we're going to get them to create the virus vaccine. That's not at all what happened. What happened is every country gave a bunch of resources to a whole bunch of labs because nobody knew who was going to come up with the answer. And in fact, 7 or 8 people came up with different answers about effective vaccines, and a whole bunch of other people we know nothing about came up with wrong answers that didn't work. But we had to do all of those experiments in order to marshal the knowledge that exists in humanity about how to combat vaccines. So the idea that expertise in its narrow field is absolutely essential to humanity, yes. The idea that expertise gives some people a mandate to run society from the apex because they know more than everybody else, absolute rubbish.
Thank you, Brian. Jim, what do you think? Did we do a good job in provoking conversation and dialogue?
Well, it achieved beyond my expectations. I mean, I think that part of Brian's intervention and the way that I construct this is that if everyone agrees with everyone else, we have failed.
Correct.
And that we, need to challenge conventional wisdom. I think that's one of the most important roles that think tanks can play, and not follow the herd. At a 2011 think tank innovation summit, which was, the intent of, how do we become more innovative in terms of policy? There was one suggestion which Brian graphically illustrates, that every think tank must have a resident skeptic or iconoclast that challenges the views of the group, not for the sake of challenging it, but constructive criticism that essentially makes us pause and think about the assumptions. That being said, and I've obviously spent my career, why think tanks matter and are important. And Andrew alluded to this, and Eric alluded to it in terms of that it has to be bottom up. That my view is we've got to get out of the ivory tower and off the sidelines and on the front lines in terms of these problems, not to be so enmeshed in it that we can't see the forest for the trees, but that we are able to challenge conventional wisdom, and that diversity and difference of opinions helps see various options that we need to consider. And then obviously, the highbrow view of speaking truth to power, I think we have to come to the realization that no one institution, no one person is the sole holder of the truth, but in diversity and in the collective wisdom. But I do disagree with Brian in one sense that there is a common ground and we need to find it. Not that it's a common ground that everyone is imposed upon them, but a common ground where we can prove as think tanks why we matter, why we can make a difference, why our institutions and expertise has value. Not that we are the holders of the truth, but as Andrew and others have suggested, and I think the fundamental problem is that think tanks are not out among the public, where we have talked about after the 2016 election, needing to get into the heartland, and the reality is almost no institutions did that. And I think we do that, and if we continue to do it, at our own peril. And so the final thing I would say in terms of a specific example is on vaccines. I mean, in terms of if we were only guided by self-interest, clearly in terms of these three countries, addressing the shortage of vaccines and the need to vaccinate those in Mexico and in Central and South America is in North America's, in terms of US and Canada's best interest. And sharing, even as I spoke with people in terms of Canada, Canada lags behind the US in terms of vaccinations, and there's a dramatic difference that Cecilia indicated in terms of Mexico. And so coming up in a common purpose in terms of sharing vaccines and disseminating them as a common objective for the South America and North America is in their national interest, not to the exclusion of the rest of the world, but it does address a problem that we all face. It is something that we can, I hope, agree on, and as an example of something that we need to do. But I want to thank all of the panelists on this very excellent panel and the previous ones, which really serves the purpose of a diversity of opinion, of sharing best practices with other institutions so that they can enhance their response to the challenges we all face. And I want to thank all of you that have participated throughout in this wonderful summit. We now have, and I would point out that I have, as a part of the new workforce and the future next gen of think tank scholars and executives, 150 research interns this summer who are working on 23 groups. One of them is a research group on North America, and for those of you who are interested and want to stay, they will now provide a presentation on the data that they have collected on think tanks in Mexico, United States, and Latin America. The data, and what I emphasize to them, is standing on the shoulders of the literature and making sure that you consult that, and that evidence matters, data matters. And I would point out that 95% of all the journal articles that I've reviewed globally have absolutely zero data on think tanks. They talk about what think tanks should do, what's wrong with think tanks, but no data. And so what you're about to see, for those who want to continue and stay, is a presentation on the data from, on average, 95%, 90+% data that we have collected on all the think tanks in Mexico, United States, and Canada. And so I now turn it over to our North America research team and Jacob Starobin. Can we have the slide share up?
Yes, if Ben could share the slides.
Ben? This is what interns, this is think tank boot camp.
I have to leave the call for a second before it lets me share, so I'll be back.
Okay. And so I'll continue to talk. Many of the interns have singed eyebrows. This is a think tank boot camp, and they know that making sure that things happen is a part of it. Okay, we don't need to see all your email. Please bear with us as we... Can you help out here? Do we have, okay, here we go.
We're ready, yeah.
Okay. All right, so as I said, there are 150 interns in the last 18 months have been collecting data on think tanks around the world, and we have done presentations like this in a number of countries and regions. Next slide. This is just an overview of TTCSP. Next, for the sake of time. Jacob, your team.
Yes. So, hi everyone. Thank you so much for coming, and for the speakers, thank you so much for your remarks. I found them very insightful. My name is Jacob Starobin. I'm one of 2 project leads for the North America team at the TTCSP. I'm a sophomore at the University of Pennsylvania studying political science and economics, and I'll quickly let Benjamin, my co-project lead, introduce himself.
Hi, everybody. My name's Benjamin. I'm the other project lead for the North America team.
Okay. And so there are 12 interns from 10 schools and 2 countries. Next slide, please. This is an overview of what the team went through. Next. Next. The objective of all the teams is to create the most comprehensive database of think tanks in North America, simultaneously to collect the most comprehensive literature in terms of publications on think tanks and policy advice in North America, to analyze the data and the literature to create an evidence-based picture of think tanks in North America, and then here to present the findings, and most importantly, in terms of these future scholars, to get the input of those in the countries, to consult with them, to get their feedback, and then incorporate their input into the report that will flow from this. Next slide. Next slide. So we always start with a definition of think tanks. Think tanks are public policy research, analysis, and engagement organizations that generate policy-oriented research, analysis, and advice on domestic and international issues, thereby enabling public policy makers and the public to make informed decisions about public policy. Next. The team has created a typology, and we now, as a part of the definition, are rethinking the definition of think tanks as just as the title infers, think tanks, that they only think. And so we've now added what we call a hybrid category to this typology of think tanks. Next. Our database and the issues in terms of policy areas that are reflected in this report cover all 15 areas. We collect data from all the think tanks in every country, region that we work in on these to get a sense of the focus of individual think tanks and then collectively within a region and a country. Next slide. Next. All right.
All right. So from 2019 to 2020, the TTCSP counted a large jump in the number of think tanks worldwide, from 8,248 to 11,175. Our team has counted in 2021 2,192 think tanks in the North American region specifically, which is a jump from the 2019 number of 2,058. Next.
And this intensive data collection that we've engaged in was prompted by an assertion by a Canadian think tank scholar who suggested that the data that we have in our database was grossly inflated. The reality, as you can see, was that it was not inflated. We have spent 18 months intensively collecting the data, that it is deflated, that there are far more think tanks that we either had not identified or were new that we now include in our database. Next slide.
And just to take a closer look, in 2020, the number of North American think tanks was 2,177. So there's been a 0.6% real increase from 2020 to 2021. Next. So as Dr. McGinnis said, our team collected data for all almost 2,200 think tanks in North America on 7 key variables, and that 8.1 is tracking top think tanks in the Global Go-To Index. And we've collected a large representative sample across all categories, as you can see here with our n sizes of analysis. Next.
Next slide.
So to put things in global context, North America think tanks make up almost 20% of think tanks worldwide. The bulk of those are in the US. The United States has more think tanks than any other single country in the world. Next slide. Next. Next, again, the United States, the vast majority of think tanks in North America. Can you go back one, Ben? There we go. Nope, forward one. We're clustering, yes. We found that think tanks tend to geographically cluster around central hubs. So you'll see that in Canada and Mexico, the vast majority of think tanks in the two countries are within just 3 states, the 3 states with the most think tanks in those countries, states or provinces. In the United States, not quite a majority, but a substantial plurality, again, in the top 3 regions with the most think tanks. So they tend to cluster geographically around central hubs. Next slide. To provide some brief historical overview, Mexico experienced a boom of think tanks in the 50s. Most think tanks today in Mexico have been founded since 1950, and the Center for Latin American Monetary Studies is a great example of a think tank founded in that period and still active, founded in 1952. Next slide. Canada experienced a similar boom in the 60s and 70s, and again, most Canadian think tanks were founded since 1960 through today. The Institute for Research on Public Policy is another great example of a think tank founded during this period of expansion and still active, founded in 1972. Next slide. And a brief history of U.S. think tanks. This chart on the left really shows that think tanks don't just cluster geographically, they cluster chronologically in terms of date established, with the 3 greatest periods of establishment being 1950 to 1980, 1975 to 88, and 1989 to 2001, each wave centering on a particular policy situation or crisis.
And following on our previous discussion, there is a clustering around a domestic or international upheaval that requires a challenging conventional wisdom and a surge in new think tanks. Next slide.
Next slide. For the sake of time, we're going to go through these pretty quickly, but think tanks tend to specialize, especially in the United States when there are so many, and in recent years they've undergone what's called hybridization, next slide, to adapt to changing circumstances, which we will address in coming slides in more detail. Next slide. So getting into the data, we're going to start with think tanks by affiliation. The overwhelming majority of think tanks in North America, go back, are unaffiliated or university affiliated. There are very few corporate, government affiliated, or political party affiliated think tanks in this region. Next slide. The distribution of focus on different policy areas is relatively different across North America, and the breakdown by country is pretty similar from country to country. Major areas of research are social policy and transparency and good governance. Notably, relatively few think tanks in all 3 of these countries focus on food, water, or global health. Next slide. For the sake of time, we're not going to get into the individual countries. Next slide. Next slide. And one more, next slide. To look at budget, if you look at just the top 20 think tanks in North America ranked by budget, it's clear that the United States is dominant in terms of think tanks with large budgets. That number is skewed down in the graph on the right because the United States has so many think tanks, many of which are university affiliated or are others with smaller budgets, whereas in Canada and Mexico, since there are only less than 100 in each of those countries, many of which are well-funded or government affiliated, there are not as many skewing the numbers down. But if you look at the most well-funded, it's clear that the United States has think tanks with substantially higher budgets on average. Next slide. We found something similar with staff. One interesting point is that top Mexican think tanks tend to have larger staff sizes than their Canadian counterparts due to Mexico's skew towards government-affiliated institutions, which can often afford larger staff. Next slide. So we identified in analyzing the data and the literature 9 key issues that stood out in terms of challenges facing think tanks. So we'll go through those systematically. Next slide. First challenge we want to talk about is funding. In recent years, donors to think tanks in North America have increasingly preferred to fund specific projects through grant-based funding in a shift away from donors supporting long-term operational costs, which can pose a pressure for think tanks to plan out their research agendas with awareness of donor interests on a project-to-project basis. And some are worried that this can restrict think tank autonomy in determining research agendas. Next slide. Now, that issue is a subject of some controversy. Many think tanks do proactively work to ensure funding transparency and prevent or respond to conflicts of interest, but because the controversy has raised the issue to such a high degree of public attention, now more than ever, all think tanks must be proactive in assuring policymakers and the public of their credibility. Next slide. And again, this stems from the idea that while legitimate concerns about funding transparency from think tanks and conflicts of interest may apply to a select specific number of think tanks, public audiences and policymaking audiences tend to hear those criticisms and apply them to all think tanks. So the entire think tank community risks losing some credibility due to the actions of a few. Next slide. Next slide. So a related topic is political polarization and partisanship. One thing we found is that as the political landscape, particularly in the United States, faces a wave of extreme partisanship that some think tanks echo, that partisanship pressures other think tanks into partisanship as well. And this example down here of skeptical environmentalist literature published by conservative think tanks prompting a wave of progressive environmentalist research from the other side of the political spectrum really embodies this kind of phenomenon. Next slide. So this quote on the right really just captures the exertion of pressure of partisanship on think tanks. Quote, "The political landscape exerts pressure on think tanks, compelling them toward either predatory behavior on the one hand and principled on the other. The bottom line being that partisanship is a substantial influencing force in how think tanks determine their research agendas." Next slide. Next slide. So media in the digital age, as we've all heard this morning, communication over COVID was a substantial issue for think tanks. The digital environment poses new challenges for think tanks' efforts to maintain and expand influence, mainly in terms of cutting through the noise of digital space, keeping up with the rush of online content, the fast pace of the environment, but also keeping up quality and not sacrificing one for the other. Next slide. Think tanks have adapted to the COVID-19 pandemic, and there's no doubt that virtual technologies, hybrid events can enable think tanks to reach wider audiences, host international events, and host events of varying adaptable sizes when used correctly. Next slide. One thing we wanted to point out is that when it comes to a sheer number of media citations, conservative think tanks tend to dominate liberal think tanks, particularly in the United States. This was actually a finding that 2 separate scholars found in 2 separate studies in 2013 and 2014, where, well, apologies. While the number of sheer media citations of centrist think tanks dominates both, when you move into more partisan institutions, conservative institutions are cited sometimes twice or 3 times as many times as liberal institutions. Next slide. Next. So in the similar vein of media, we want to talk about technology and public engagement, the bottom line being engagement matters. Right now, only 50% of Americans know what think tanks do. Only 20% trust what think tanks do. And a recent article in Foreign Policy magazine really captured the public sentiment that think tanks have, quote, a serious and perhaps also a deserved reputation problem. And so, whether that reputation problem is in fact deserved is obviously a subject of serious debate, but what is clear is that think tanks need to engage the public in meaningful dialogue on policy, not just to inform the public on policy, but to inform the public on the value of think tank research and coming to your own conclusions and shaping policy from a higher levels of government influence. Next slide. Next slide. So we want to also address the important issue of diversity within think tank staff. As Dr. McGann noted earlier, this is an issue important to the TTCSP. When we were researching this issue, we found that many think tanks do not publish demographics of their staff. So there is a relative lack of data and literature on the issue, which is something that can and should change in coming years, although the topic has been pushed to the fore of the literature in the past year or so, especially with the racial reckoning surrounding the murder of George Floyd. Next slide. So there are a number of suggestions that scholars make in terms of improving or ensuring diversity of think tank staff. We want to highlight, can't do everything for the sake of time, that changing the culture can be as hard or harder than changing the numbers, and that the key thing is recruiting, nurturing, and retaining a diverse workforce at a think tank. But after that workforce is hired, there may still be more work to do. Next slide. So again, the TTCSP is working to center this issue in its research. We're currently collecting data from a number of institutions to evaluate where diversity of think tank staff is overall, but some institutions have published their data or undertaken specialized initiatives to address this issue.
And you are encouraged in all of this to help us with the data by sharing it.
Yes. Next slide. Next slide. We can't, for the sake of time, we are skipping some of the denser ones. Next slide. So artificial intelligence is another key issue that has really exploded in the past 5 to 10 years. Technologies like big data, machine learning, natural language processing can change the way think tanks conduct their research to answer pressing policy questions. Next slide. But we should note the flip side of this is that AI itself presents new opportunities for think tanks to research and offer policy advice. There's a substantial lack of existing regulations, policy norms, and definitions surrounding AI technology, and these are all areas that are in need of policy advice and expertise. Next slide. So in the push to not only research the issue, but to incorporate these technologies into your research, it's important to get ahead of the curve. Those who wait to implement this technology risk falling behind competitor organizations that already are implementing AI and devoting substantial resources to researching the topic. Next slide. Yeah. Cybersecurity is a related issue in the field of technological advancement. Think tanks should understand that they are prime targets for hackers in 2021. This quote on the right from an FBI and CISA report really captures it. Quote, given the importance that think tanks can have in shaping U.S. policy, CISA and FBI urge individuals and organizations in the international affairs and national security sectors to immediately adopt a heightened state of awareness of cyber threats. And that goes for think tanks as much as governments themselves. Installing antivirus software, increasing awareness among employees of cyber threats are crucial to protecting think tanks from actors that want to target them for their policy influence. Next slide. Next. Yeah. So globalization is another crucial topic right now. We want to note that Chinese competition has surged in recent years, which is notable because the United States has in the past unequivocally dominated in terms of sheer numbers. But from 2010 to 2020, the US increased only about 200 think tanks. The number of Chinese think tanks exploded by almost 1,000. So China's emerging as a real competitor in the policy arena globally. Next slide. Next slide. And next slide, yeah. So finally, we want to acknowledge that COVID-19 has been a transformative issue, particularly in the past year, and the virtual landscape that it has forced think tanks to adapt to is going to be part of the new normal. It may not be as omnipresent as it was when we were all locked down, but it's the technologies that were used to have hybrid events and reach wider audiences are not going away, and members of think tank audiences still rely on them, and so think tanks need to be aware that the virtual landscape is a new facet of the post-COVID world. Next slide. Next slide. One more, yeah. So this slide succinctly summarizes the discussion of the key issues we've identified. For the sake of time, I'm just going to focus on two of them. Funding is a major issue. Funding controversies erode public trust in think tank research, and a lack of long-term funding has resulted in donor-specific or partisan pressures. And these are really crucial to address for think tanks to retain trust and influence with their audiences. For tech and public engagement, a lack of public awareness of think tank operations is impacting the influence think tanks have in public dialogue, and the digital landscape forces think tanks to communicate faster and via more channels. Next slide.
Thank you.
So we're just going to quickly go through some concrete recommendations. For funding, a big one is to prioritize seeking out long-term funding and flexible core support rather than short-term funding to ensure think tank autonomy. Next slide. Political polarization and partisanship is an issue we've been following for a while. In 2016, we published Research Policies and Procedures, Issues, Trends, and Best Practices, which discusses this issue at length and provides a series of concrete recommendations. So that report, sometimes referred to as the Quality, Independence, and Integrity, or QII report, is really going to have a long list of concrete recommendations to address this issue. Next slide. For media, the main point is that think tanks must maintain standards of quality and simultaneously keep up with the fast pace of digital media to cut through the noise rather than adding to it. Next slide. In that vein, think tanks should recruit and train staff to create teams proficient with digital and social media platforms, as these platforms command large swaths of public attention and they are relevant, but they require skills to use. Next slide. With regard to diversity, as you heard, particularly in the last panel this morning, think tanks should make an institutional commitment to recruiting, nurturing, and retaining a diverse workforce, not just for the normative reasons, although those are incredibly important, but also because research is better when many perspectives are in the room looking at it. With the awareness that after a workforce is diverse and recruited and retained, there is still more work to do in making think tanks inclusive spaces. Next slide.
We're going to have to speed up a little so we have time for Q&A.
For sure. Train staff in integrating AI research technologies and don't get left behind. Next slide. Understand that think tanks are targets of cyber threats and take action now to prevent cyber attacks or mitigate them, back up your data, install antivirus software. Next slide. Collaboration is crucial in an era of globalization, and yeah, approach global problems with regional perspectives and regional problems with global awareness. Next slide. And finally, in a post-COVID landscape, think tanks must become smarter, better, faster, more agile, and more digital, as Dr. McGann has said throughout this morning's program, to survive in a post-COVID world. Next slide. So with that, I'll turn things back over to Dr. McGann. Thank you so much for attending this presentation, and we'll look forward to your questions.
We very much appreciate your patience and endurance. We know this has gone on for some time, but we now would encourage your questions and reactions. We know that it's a lot to take in, but the objective here is to demonstrate, as Jacob and Benjamin, the two project leads, have very ably demonstrated their command of the material, and since April, the work that they have put in generating this report. I would point out many of my colleagues really have a dim view of undergraduates and what they can do. I would point out that Jacob is a freshman in college, and so mightily impressed with what he has done. I hope you all are. But I now turn it over to questions from the audience. Any quick reactions? Or what do you see as the major challenges? Can we go back to the summary slide for the key issues so that people can see that? So the question is, are there issues or challenges facing think tanks that are not reflected on this list of 9 challenges facing think tanks? Zua has a question.
Hi, Dr. McGann. Thank you so much for the presentation, Jacob. My question is regarding the development pace of specifically Mexico, so a country, or Canada, that the 2 countries in North America that have been kind of slower than the United States, which had the bulk of think tanks in the beginning. Has the development pace been the same as it was for the United States in North America, perhaps in early 20th century, or has it been different?
That's a good question. Yeah, so the number of think tanks in Mexico or Canada has been under 100. It's wavered between 70 and 90 in each for at least the past 10 years, and I believe longer. I don't believe that number is increasing in any rapid capacity. And definitely the explosion of think tanks in the United States started earlier and was more dramatic than in those 2 countries. So there's not much of a contest in terms of just sheer numbers of think tanks in Canada and Mexico versus the United States.
I have done research on what I call comparative think tanks, politics, and public policy. And one of the key questions, which has really been behind my research since my dissertation, too many years ago, is what explains the large number relative to every other country in the world, the large number of think tanks in the U.S. And so one has to look at issues of philanthropy, the media, the political system and culture. So for instance, in the U.S., it's highly decentralized, federal, state, and local. And it is, in terms of a political culture, that is not a recent mantra, but one from the inception of the Republic, that a government that governs least governs best. And a proclivity to seek outside expertise. And the 9/11 Commission, the greatest challenge to the United States was not entrusted to bureaucrats or a congressional or legislative or parliamentary committee to examine it. If you look at that committee, it is constituted, the membership is almost entirely by current or former think tanks, scholars, and executives. And the point of that is that we trust outside expertise more than we trust our government, and that's deeply embedded in the political culture. And then obviously the philanthropic culture and the focus on diversity in terms of the U.S. Provides that. The other more dominant potentially is around political system. The nature of our political system is open and open in the sense that there are many points of access, whereas in the parliamentary model, where both the legislative and executive branches are fused, there are narrower set of points of access, which explains why there are fewer. Cecilia may have an explanation in terms of Mexico. Yes, Cecilia.
Jim, yeah, wonderful job, Jacob. Really, and your group, you're really great. I wish we had a few of you sometime one summer.
Let me stop you there. Part of the objective in having 150 interns is to flood the market with them. So, and I should say that they are multilingual. So every team, they are from all over the world. They speak 2 or 3 languages, and there is a large number that are fluent in Spanish, either proficient or native. So
I wish we can
invite you a list
for our programs in the future. I will let you know which ones are they. I am shocked by the number you're giving of think tanks in Mexico. It can't be true. I mean, who is a think tank? The one that says I'm a think tank? How do you? I would love to see your list. I'm not criticizing your job. It's just that I can't believe that we have so many, because it's not part of the Mexican culture. I mean, as Jim was saying, as you know, think tanks is a very American phenomenon. It has spread around the world for the same reason, because it's an American phenomenon. But not, you know, I can hardly think of 5, not hundreds. What has exploded over the last decade or two is consulting firms that sort of do research, very specific, but on demand, you know, and may or may not charge for it. It doesn't have to be non-profit, but I would love to learn about where these think tanks are, because the first thing I would do is to bring them together. Well, to organize a meeting like the one you have organized now of Mexican think tanks. But I don't think anybody knows of think tanks in Mexico. I'm exaggerating only a bit.
Yeah, well, I mean, this has been an 18-month process. Jacob and his team have intensively verified both the data for all of these, and part of this effort is to share that information with you, and also, you know, some of it is clearly in terms of university-affiliated think tanks, or so, you know, that both in the U.S. and elsewhere, you know, expands the numbers. But Ed Greenspoon, please, and then Alejandro Chofin.
Oh,
yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Ed.
Thank you, Jim. A great piece of work. There's a couple things I'd, you know, just maybe you have some answers to this. Maybe you, maybe it's through further research. One on the question of what people are doing to cut through the noise other than being ideological. So there seems to be a propensity that more ideological think tanks get more media attention. And I'd just like to are there examples, case studies of things that people are doing to cut through the noise that isn't illogical? And second is on AI. I would just love to hear some examples, if there's some available, of how think tanks, clever, interesting ways that think tanks are operating to use AI. And if that's not available, I would love that as a follow-up.
Yeah, so two responses. One, which was not, we didn't have time to do it, but in terms of the funding and in terms of survival and marketing in a very crowded marketplace of ideas, that think tanks have done two things. One, have specialized and become much more niche oriented, meaning that they have a specialization, and that specialization takes two forms. One is in a specific subject area or area of public policy research, and the second, increasingly, which contributes to the polarization, is on in terms of ideology. And so, what is your political stripe? So we have a chart in terms of clearly delineating what are progressive versus centrist versus right of center, and that has become increasingly so that donors know what they're getting. That the specialization is this is what brand of philosophy that we embrace, and that has as Jacob in the presentation pointed out. The second. Is an easier one. We convened a group at the request of the leading think tanks in the U.S. and around the world, a major summit on AI for think tanks. And the basic view was, and interest was, what is the impact of AI on think tanks, public policy, and the public? There's a report on that, which is on Scholarly Commons, which summarizes it. And I could say three things. One, if you want to know an institution that has harnessed technology, harnessed AI, and essentially trained or retrained its staff on AI, it's the Urban Institute. They have really, the key finding coming out of that meeting was two or threefold. One was what I just said. But related to that is that most think tanks focus on AI policy and the implications of AI policy. The U.S. is in the lead with that relative to Europe and the rest of the world. But very few are turning that internally and adopting AI to enhance their research and public engagement. So those two things are available. And I hope that sort of addresses your question. Alejandro.
I don't have, well, I just posted, as you know, I spent all my life in think tanks, and I'm on the board of some of the best in the world, and also in a couple of grant-giving foundations that supports many. So I like to see the data. Congrats, because I know nothing is perfect, but you're the only one who makes, I think, an effort to measure think tanks globally. Other empirical studies based mostly on networking, on assumptions, on conspirations, but thank you for doing this. No, my little question is, I think with the growth of Chinese Institute, China does not intend to stay just within its borders with its influence. Do you have any idea if this Chinese think tanks, the level of number of allies they have in North America, Canada, US, Mexico, each of those territories is very different. I think they're afraid to get into Mexico given the control, the big power of the crony capitalists and drug cartels there. It's not easy for the government there. So,
well, I can address that. One is the dramatic quantity is not quality. And so, I have been following Chinese think tanks. In fact, Xi Jinping often will make a very public statement on think tanks because I go every year, a day or two before I come. He has stated several things. One, that think tanks in China need to rival the great think tanks in the world, Brookings, Chatham House, IFPRI, etc. And that think tanks, which is the other key part, are the key force behind modernization and reform in China. He has mentioned think tanks more than any other institution as being key to the future modernization and reform in China. What he means by modernization and reform is a whole other thing. The regulation, he has blessed 25, 30 think tanks, which is in stark contrast to the rankings that we have, because they're not the same list in terms of what is reviewed globally. I've just written a piece to sort of underscore the problems with Chinese think tanks. Their websites are black holes, and the title of the chapter that I've written is Think Tanks, the New Great Wall of China. And the view is that think tanks are only serving the internally. They're not engaging in meaningful partnerships. And if Xi Jinping believes in the greatness and the potential of Chinese think tanks, they need to modernize and reform think tanks. They do not adhere to basic social science research standards. Alex, in response to your question, many think tanks, 30 or 40 of them in Europe, in terms of changing opinions, it's a little less so in Latin America, and there's a complex set of reasons for that. But the 30 or 40 think tanks in Europe have essentially signed a joint letter demanding the removal of a series of critical European think tanks, critical of China's, some of the, fairly straightforward issues and problems. They have blacklisted those think tanks, and 40 think tanks of the leading think tanks in Europe have banded together to protest and demand a public response. China has responded by asking for, in order to pick institutions off one by one, individual meetings, and the response of the group is, you meet with all of us or you meet with none of us. And
in line with this, I know that our CEO, also very influential, Chris Martin, was in the beginning, and none of his now. We had a board meeting at Acton. I want to warn you, they don't play clean. The closest think tank in our world, Unirule, was closed. But if you recall, 2 months ago, there was a breach in Microsoft Outlook, and they targeted think tanks. Yeah. We hired independent agencies to research, and Acton was one of the number one targets. It could be because we produced a movie in the past, and we are doing another one about Jimmy Lai, who is the owner of the newspaper that now is in jail, and the newspaper has been closed. But again, China is the major trading ally with most Latin American countries, so they're using all their political power of the Chinese Communist Party to silence anyone, as you described, who criticizes them. So be aware.
And we continue to put, those think tanks on the list. The other thing that we're doing is with the QII and developing, if you want to be the great think tanks in the world, there are basic, not US, not Western, but universal basic social science research standards, or the scientific method. And so you need to essentially adhere to those if you want to rival the great think tanks in the West, as Xi Jinping has said. And that means, where did you get the data? What's the source? Can it be replicated? And as I said, many of the websites are black holes. There is no access to any of the scholars. All of these very basic things are what they need to be challenged on and encouraged to reform themselves. Any other questions or comments? We're now over time by 5 minutes, which is fine. And the endurance, the people are still here. If anyone has a final question, but we will show mercy and end at this point, unless there is a compelling question that someone has. Going once? Going twice? We will close. Thank you all very much for an incredibly engaging session. Thanks to my interns who on the North America team have done a phenomenal job. I always emphasize, singe their eyebrows by saying you must do a professional quality work product. I hope you agree that what this team has produced is an exceptional and of the highest professional quality. So thank you all. Thanks to the team, and we welcome your further input, and we will share the list, Cecilia and others, so you can double check it and show if we've missed institutions or if we should add some that we have not had. Thank you, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Ciao, guys. Congrats.
Adiós.